At the moment, the young lady was happy because she was marrying an earl who did not play an important role in history. She was glad because she knew that they were just in a contract marriage, but she clearly understood the fact that today she was the happiest bride in the world. It was originally intended that she would be brutally murdered by her fiancé on their wedding night. Raphael Kronhart, the true hidden villain of the whole story, she knew he would easily get even with her without batting an eye. Trembling with fear, she glanced sideways at her future husband, knowing that he had saved her from that fate. Kale Belbrington, the gradual hero, who was never mentioned in the original, was quite handsome. Enrica, in turn, called the young man with a smile and thanked him for agreeing to a contract marriage. She smiled and said shyly that if it weren't for him, she would have been forced to become the Duke's bride, and she would have had to avoid it until this moment. He looked at her with a tender smile and said that he was very glad that he had met her before she ran away. Enrica moved away from the young man, blinded by his striking beauty. A few seconds later, they entered the hall and the man introduced the bride. Enrica looked intently at everyone present. At the same time, the man introduced the groom. Like Lord Lien, Calusi, Leon Matina, and Elaz. The young lady stood there for a moment, confused. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really owned that much land. He smiled but did not answer. He was also a count watched over the borders, and was also the commander of the knights. Enrica was surprised she didn't understand why a minor character had such a rich background, but she knew that as long as the Duke from the original story wasn't around, everything would be fine. The man said that the young man was also the sword of the Empire and was the master of the Kronhart house. She froze in shock on the spot. The man looked intently at Archduke Raphael Kronhart. She froze in shock as she looked at her future husband. Enrica was terrified, because the one she was running away from was next to her the whole time. But the young man only looked at her with a smile and suggested that she go further. He looked at her with a predatory smile and called her his bride, while she was still in a state of shock. A month ago, she discovered that she was in a novel in which the minor characters in the novel were much more popular than the main characters. The infamous villain and the secret mastermind behind the Archduke who aided her. A complex relationship entangled in submission and obsession, a subtle emotional connection that can easily be mistaken for love. The chemistry between the young people was incredible, and readers were left wishing for them to be together despite their misdeeds. Thus, a fateful meeting of villains took place. The Duke, eager to accuse someone of a crime, took as his wife a woman with whom he entered into a political union. He did this only to kill her on their wedding night. While covering up the crime scene, he encounters the villain who was hiding under the guise of a servant. Intrigued by her silence, even though she had witnessed the murder, he soon discovered that she had abilities in dark magic. This moment marked the beginning of their path of ruthless evil. Enrica sighed heavily, as she knew it was exciting. After all, she was just a reader. But the problem was that the body she possessed belonged to a bride who had been killed on her wedding night. She was puzzled because she didn't know what to do now and how to get out of this situation. After she took over the body of the young lady, she learned something because the girl was once a magician, but her family exploited her all her life. After her body weakened, causing her to lose her magic, they married her to the Duke. She saw that she still had respect and magic left. She was puzzled because she knew that they were pushing her to the edge of the abyss. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback as she heard some noise outside the door. The man burst into his daughter's room and angrily asked if it was true that her magic was almost exhausted. He shouted furiously for her to tell him immediately that all the rumors were simply lies. Enrica said with tears in her eyes that it was true, she regretted it, and thought that her body had reached its limit. He was furious and shouted that she was worthless, a scoundrel, and just a burden to their family. Duke Wintersore, a rude duke who treated his own daughter as nothing more than a magical instrument. She sighed heavily and said that she was truly sorry and would find a way to restore her magic by any means necessary. He looked at her with contempt and fury and said that she was a failure to attend the banquet on behalf of the duchy and would bring shame on them. She knew that he was telling the truth and therefore hoped that he would realize this fact and not send her to the banquet. He shouted as he left that this would be her first appearance in public after the Archduke's proposal, so she should behave appropriately. The young lady sighed heavily because she did not want to go to any banquet at all. A month had passed since she had taken possession of the new body, and since her magic had run out, She had almost nothing to do. A moment later, she jumped off the sofa as she heard that the maid had come to her. Enrica was puzzled because she had to endure the presence of the villain who stood next to her and watched her die. She looked at her maid with a joyful smile, while trembling with fear, but still said that she had been waiting for her. She was puzzled, but she knew that she had no choice, and she had to start the game herself. The young lady worked very hard after arriving in the new world. She tried in every way to defeat the villain and make her happy. With the speed of lightning, the young lady rushed to her maid and said with a smile that she had missed her. Looking at her maid, she understood that if she found herself in her sights, she could lose her head even before she married the Archduke. Sarah looked intently at her mistress, and picking up the scissors, asked her to sit down, as there was little time left before the banquet. Enrica was puzzled, but she still fulfilled her maid's request, knowing that she had no other choice. But still, the maid frightened her, and for some time, she sat quietly. She saw that Sarah had brightly colored hair and sharply set eyes, and she had a face that seemed to scream that she was a villain. And looking at herself in the mirror, she saw only a cute puppet. Enrica asked Sarah what she thought about the proposal that the Archduke had made to her. Sarah was furious and shouted that, of course, she was against it. Trembling with fear, the young lady asked if there was any reason for this. Sarah sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, she did not have enough time to keep my lady near the slaughter. She looked away from her mistress in embarrassment and said that she meant that she was still too young. Sarah smiled and told the lady that it would be better if she began to explore the world with hers. Enrica, in turn, was touched by the words of her maid, and a moment later, she rushed towards her with embarrassment, hugging her. She knew that her efforts to conquer the maid were not in vain, as she initially offered her snacks with a smile. She didn't force her to do hard work, and she also kept her secrets with delight. Enrica smiled and told the maid that she had been cold, but when she expressed her concern for her, she realized that her maid had thawed. Sarah told the young lady that the more she saw her, the more she reminded her of Lily. Enrica looked at her maid in surprise, as she did not understand what she was talking about. Sarah smiled and said that she had a puppy when she was a child, and it had light and fluffy fur. Enrica didn't know if she should be happy. A moment later, the maid informed her mistress that she was ready. Sarah smiled and told the young lady that since things had gone too far, she should just enjoy life. She looked at the lady intently and said that perhaps this was her last banquet before the wedding. The lady froze for a moment. She couldn't relax, even knowing that Sarah was on her side. She was puzzled because she knew that this was her last banquet before the wedding. She knew that this could very well be her last banquet in life, so she was ready to enjoy it to the fullest. After some time, she entered the hall, and everyone began to talk about her, because they knew that there was nothing special about her, and she was supposed to marry the Duke. The Countess looked at the young woman with a smile and said that she had come on time. Enrica bowed and thanked the Countess for the invitation. The Countess smiled and said that they had just been talking about the upcoming wedding. Everyone was surprised and could not think that the frightening Duke had fallen in love with her, and so they asked if the rumors were true. The Countess smiled and told the young league not to be embarrassed, as everyone already knew. She asked in bewilderment what they were talking about. Everyone said that the Duke could not wait, so he called off the engagement and immediately proposed. The Countess smiled and said that he did not want other men to see her beauty, so all dates took place in secret. She smiled and said that she heard day and night that the Duke was sending gifts to the duchy. She was shocked because she realized that she had recently seen suspicious crews that had been riding around in recent days. She knew that her father was the type of man who would sell his daughter for a fortune without a second thought. Thinking about this, she realized that she was the perfect scapegoat who could be killed if necessary. She understood that her father would not bother himself too much in investigating the case of her death. And now that everyone was sure that the Duke was in love with her, he had an impeccable alibi. She was in shock, wondering if she could survive in such a world. The Duchess looked at the young lady with concern and asked if she was all right, as she did not look well. Enrica asked for forgiveness, as she felt dizzy from her long stay in the carriage. The Duchess told the young lady to go and rest. A moment later, the young lady whispered something quietly to the Countess. The Countess smiled and called Enrique, as she had good news. The Countess was a little puzzled, as she was about to tell the young lady that the Duke was also at the banquet, but she had already run away. At the same time, the young lady walked slowly along the long corridor. She understood that now that the rumors had spread, she would not be able to break off the engagement. She was puzzled because she didn't know what to do, so she wanted to go out into the fresh air for a while and think. When she went out onto the terrace, she was taken aback because she saw that someone was there. She froze for a moment as she saw the young man. She was shocked because she did not expect to see anyone at all, and at the same time the young man was drinking wine. Enrica was taken aback and asked for forgiveness, as she had not noticed him. He smiled and said that everything was fine. She froze when she heard his amazing voice. A moment later, the young man came closer to her. She looked at him intently and realized that if Winter were a person, she would have his face. For a moment, she stared at the handsome young man who was next to her. Enrica stared at the young man for a while longer, without uttering a single word. He in turn only smiled tenderly at her. She was embarrassed by his smile, and I realized perfectly well that he didn't look like a secondary character at all, considering how handsome he was. She immediately recognized the Duke and her maid Sarah after her rebirth. But she had no memories of this man's face. She had never even seen it in the illustrations of the novel. After asking for forgiveness, she asked if she could know his name. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really didn't know him. She looked at him with bewilderment and wondered if he was being too self-confident. A moment later, the young man said that he was Count Kale Belbrington. She smiled and introduced herself. Enrica looked at him in bewilderment, as she had never heard such a name. She hoped that he was not the main character, but at the same time, the young man looked at her with a smile. She asked if he was expecting someone. He sighed heavily and said that he was not. But a moment later, he said with a smile that he seemed to have been waiting for her without even realizing it. Kyle asked the young lady with a smile if she would like to have a drink with him. She looked at him closely, as he was surprisingly calm, despite how he looked. She wanted to forget herself for a moment and enjoy a nice banquet with her kind and handsome man, so she accepted his proposal. But after a few glasses, she burst into tears and screamed that she really didn't want to get married. Enrica got into the atmosphere, and too much fell out. She sighed heavily and said that if she could only avoid this, she would do anything. A moment later, she stared into the distance, her gaze filled with sadness. The young man looked at her intently and asked if there was something wrong with her fiancé, since she was against the wedding. He asked if her fiancé did not respect her, or if there were unflattering rumors about him. She couldn't say that he would kill her in the future, because she understood that he would take her for a madwoman. She screamed that she really wanted to avoid the wedding. She said it was a big secret, but if she couldn't avoid the wedding, she was considering leaving the empire. The young man was puzzled by what he heard. He did not expect such a thing at all. In surprise, he broke a glass of wine. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was okay. He looked at her with a cold gaze and asked if she loved someone else. Enrica said that this was not the case at all, and she did not understand what his reaction was. He asked if she simply didn't want to get married. She said that if it was someone else, she wouldn't mind. He came closer to her and said with a grin that she had a way out of this situation. Looking at the young lady, he said that her groom should be a different man. He smiled and asked if she wanted to just marry another man. She froze for a moment, looking at the young man, since she herself had not thought of such a thing. She wondered if she should marry another man, but she could do so since she had not responded to the Archduke's proposal. She was glad because she could easily marry someone else. Enrica smiled and said that was a great idea. But a moment later, her expression changed, and she asked if he really thought she would be able to find someone to marry right now. He smiled and said that she was beautiful and graceful, and if she extended her hand, there would be many who would take it. But a moment later, he looked at her with fury and asked how she dared. Enrica asked in surprise if he had said anything. He smiled and said that he hadn't said anything. She knew that a marriage of convenience was a great idea. Even if she wanted to marry to avoid the Duke, she had no one else to choose. She knew she had no friends, let alone any suitors, as her father didn't want anyone to know she was a mage. She was furious, but she knew she shouldn't give up because there were chances to survive. But she was puzzled because she didn't know what to do in this situation. With the speed of lightning, she turned around, catching her companion by surprise. She looked at him with confidence. While on wine later, she called the Count and looked at him with tenderness. He froze for a moment, not knowing what she wanted to say. She tenderly took his hand and asked if he wanted to marry her. Kale looked intently at his companion, but said nothing. Enrica asked him for help and said that they should be together for only 1 year, and later she would divorce him and pay compensation. At first, the young man let go of her hand, but then he squeezed it tenderly and agreed with a smile. She froze for a moment in embarrassment. He smiled and said he would wait. But after a few seconds, she asked, confused, if he was talking about compensation or divorce. He looked at her tenderly and said that he would wait for a marriage proposal. She was shocked that he agreed so quickly and easily, but she was truly glad. A moment later, she slapped herself in the face, thinking she must have just been sleeping. He looked at her with a gentle smile and said that she didn't need to worry because he would hurt her. She froze in embarrassment, as she had not expected this. Enrica pulled away from him in embarrassment and said that her father would be against the wedding. He looked at her intently and with a sly smile said that he would solve this issue, she just needed to focus on preparing for the wedding. Enrica, looking away, said that the fact that she had already been proposed to had spread through high society. He looked at her predatorily and asked if it would be okay if he went to the temple right now and took the marriage vows. Enrica smiled and asked if they could really do that. He said with a smile that of course she should trust him too. Enrica thought that his words were most likely just bragging, but they gave her peace and strength. He smiled and extended his hand to her and said that they could show at the banquet that she was now dating someone else. She looked at him with an embarrassed smile, but accepted his offer. A few seconds later, they entered the banquet hall. Everyone immediately started whispering. She expected this as she knew that this was unexpected news for everyone. He smiled and told her not to worry. Kale looked at her sideways and asked if he wasn't with her now. She smiled tenderly and thanked him for his support. But after a few seconds, she asked with a smile what his full name was. He looked at her intently, without answering the question. At the same time, everyone was taken aback and froze in shock. But at that very moment, he leaned closer to her and hugged her. She froze for a moment. Kale touched her hair tenderly. She froze in embarrassment. But at that very moment, everyone froze in shock seeing such a spectacle. He smiled a predatory smile and said that she could just call him Kale. After the banquet was over, he asked if she could get there on her own, and with the last of her strength, she said that the carriage had already been served and she would go. Enrica looked at the young man and said that he needed to keep his promise and find her. He smiled and said that she had walked with him in front of everyone, and now they were lovers, so he would find her. As she got into the carriage, she smiled and said that in that case she would leave him, but a moment later she froze in place as he called her. Kale looked at her with a tender smile and said that he was glad to meet her today. She smiled a radiant smile and said that she was also glad to meet him at the banquet. At the same time, the young man ran in a hurry to his master, as he had been looking for him for a long time. But at the same time, the young man turned to his master and called him Archduke. Kyle, looking at his subordinate, said that from now on, he was an ordinary count, and he should be more careful with his title. Melua looked at his master in bewilderment, as he did not understand what had happened at all. Kale asked his assistant in confusion why the young lady did not know him. Kale told the assistant that they had met her before, but she did not recognize him and asked his name. The young man said that there was nothing strange in this, because his master did not attend receptions. She might not know him, and knowing how the Duke controlled his daughter, she might not have known the news of his circle. A moment later, the young man said with a grin that it seemed like the task wasn't difficult. As he was leaving, he told his subordinate that from now on he was a count, but the latter was puzzled as he wanted to hear an explanation. But the young man in turn was immersed in his thoughts and did not answer. A few seconds later, he told his assistant that he knew how much he needed her. He sighed heavily and said with a fierce grin that she had to be on his side, even if he had to play a double game to do so. Sometime later, the young lady returned home, but she froze for a moment because she saw that there was no one there. She knew that even though she was the eldest daughter, no one had met her, but unfortunately, she had already become accustomed to such a cold attitude. She knew it was for the best, because she wanted to get to her room as quickly as possible and go to bed. But a moment later, the butler informed her that the gentleman was waiting for her in the office. She was surprised that her father called her, but at the same time, she was puzzled since all her plans had failed. After some time, she came to her father's office. He looked at her coldly and said that she was tense, but at least she looked presentable. She was shocked as he assessed her. She wondered if he really spoke like that about his daughter. He looked closely at his daughter and said that he had previously heard that the Archduke had attended the banquet. He looked casually at his daughter and asked if she had greeted him. The young lady froze in shock and wondered if the Archduke had been at the banquet. She was shocked because she realized that he had seen everything that happened. She raised that he had seen the young man approach her and declare his intentions. Trembling with fear, she wondered if she would die at the hands of the Archduke before she could marry. The Duke of Winterthur looked at his daughter with bewilderment and asked why she looked like that. He asked if she had never met her boyfriend. She was taken aback and said that it was not so, and she even greeted him. A moment later, he looked at her with a grin and said that she had finally become useful. The Duke of Winterthur said, looking at his daughter, that she must remember that if she is of use to the family, she is of use to herself. She looked closely at the Duke, for she saw that this was the first time his gaze was not cold. She sighed heavily and asked her father, what if she said she didn't want to marry the Archduke? He looked at his daughter with fury, but a few seconds later, he hit her in the face with cold fury. He was angry because he had barely praised her, and she had already managed to lose her mind. He shouted at her to leave immediately, and if she dared to say such nonsense ever again, she would get a slap in the face. A moment later, the young lady finally left his office and sighed heavily. Enrica was upset, but in turn, she knew that she could not expect anything else from him. At the same time, Sarah was going about her daily business. But when she saw that her mistress had come to her, she froze for a moment. Enrica looked at her maid with a smile and called her, but at the same time, she tried to be direct. Sarah rushed hastily to the voice of her mistress. Some time later, Sarah was treating the lady's wound, and during the conversation, she asked the lady if she remembered her dog. Sarah sighed heavily and said that when she was little, her dog went for a walk alone. But after some time, she came with a badly injured paw, and she herself was covered in scratches. Sarah said the local bullies didn't like that. She didn't communicate with them, so they took it out on the dog. Unfortunately, after some time, they regretted what they did. Enrica was trembling because she didn't know who in their right mind would dare to harm the villain's dog. Sarah sighed heavily and said that when she looked at her mistress, she saw the appearance of her dog. The young lady looked intently at her maid without uttering a word. Enrica knew that just because her friend was a villain meant she was not at all like her father. She always knew and felt who really cared about her. Even from her conversation with the maid, she knew that she was protecting her in her own way. Enrica smiled and said that there was good news because she was going to get married. Sarah sighed heavily and said that she knew about it, but Milady said that she was not marrying the Archduke. After all, at the banquet, she met a man. Sarah was shocked because she did not expect this. She pounced on her mistress and asked what she was even talking about. Enrica tried to calm her maid down. A moment later, the maid looked intently at her mistress and began to bombard her with questions from behind. She was taken aback by the range of questions, but said that the young man was the most handsome man she had ever seen. Sarah sighed heavily and said that tall men were short-sighted and handsome men were liars. Enrica looked at her maid with a smile. A moment later, she said she understood why she didn't trust her decision. Enrica looked intently at her friend and said that when they met again, she would introduce him to her. She said that if she didn't like him, she would give up on the whole idea. Enrica hoped that she had reassured her maid. A moment later, Sarah walked up to her mistress and hugged her tenderly. Enrica looked at her maid with embarrassment. Sarah looked away from her mistress and said that it was not that she did not trust her. She sighed heavily and said that she was just afraid that bad people were hurting her. Enrica was glad that she had someone like Sarah by her side, because at first she was afraid of her, because she knew she was a villain. But now she saw that Sarah was like an older sister to her, someone she could trust. The next day, the young lady woke up and saw that her cheek was still red. Sarah looked sideways at her mistress and said that if she put on makeup, the situation would only get worse. A moment later, she looked at her mistress and said that she would take 100 times more revenge on whoever did this to her face. The young lady, trembling with fear, thanked her maid. A moment later, a maid entered the lady's room and said that Martha was asking her to join her for tea. Enrica looked at the woman, knowing that she was her sister's maid. Martha Winterthur was the favorite in the house and was her younger sister, who was different from her. Compared to her, She was not shy about showing affection to her father. She also communicated easily with the servants, earning good reviews. Martha paid no attention to her older sister. At the same time, the young lady was puzzled and did not understand why her sister was so hostile towards her. Often Martha secretly caused her a lot of trouble. She especially constantly spread strange rumors about her among the servants. As a result, she became a villain who tormented her younger sister. Because of this, in the house, she was treated like a pale mouse. The maid told the lady that Mrs. Martha was currently out for a walk, so she should go the other way. The maid, with a haughty smile, told the young lady that the outfit should go to Madame Martha, since she would represent her better. The chef told the young lady that the food had not spoiled at all, and if it had, Martha would have told him about it. She was puzzled because she had to deal with outright disdain. But to her surprise, Martha suddenly invited her to tea. Enrica clearly understood that this was not without reason. Sarah, with the speed of lightning, shielded her mistress with her body and said that she could not come today because she was not feeling well. The maid looked at them with disdain and said that it was simply disrespectful to refuse Mrs. Martha's invitation on such grounds. But Sarah looked at the maid with fury with her murderous gaze. The maid was taken aback, as she was not prepared for such a confrontation. Enrica looked at us with admiration at her maid, as she was very cool and reliable. Enrica thanked her maid. Sarah told her mistress that if she went out into the street with her face like that, she might get a scar. Enrica smiled and said that she would still be better off going to the tea party. Sarah was a little surprised. Enrica smiled and said that she would do so, and asked her maid to help her prepare. At the same time, the young lady was sitting quietly in the garden and drinking tea. Enrica went to meet her sister. Martha told her sister with a grin that she had eventually agreed, but for some reason hadn't wanted to at first. A moment later, the young lady froze in place surprised. Enrica greeted her sister. She sat down slowly at the table and wondered if she had enjoyed seeing their father beat her. The young lady was taken aback and said that this time her father had clearly gone too far. They looked at her with bewilderment as they saw that she had some kind of strange look. Martha pounced on the maid and asked if she could have treated the wounds properly. She did not understand why her sister was in such a state. Sarah looked coldly at the young lady and said that she had applied the ointment yesterday, so everything was fine. Martha looked at her furiously and asked if she was sure she was furious and worried that her sister would be left with a scar. Sarah sighed heavily and looked away, but a moment later, she said that in that case, she would make sure that the Duke had the same look on his face. Enrica tried to stop her maid. Enrica smiled and asked her maid if she could bring some pie from her kitchen, as she thought it would be nice with tea. A moment later, the young lady sighed heavily as she finally had a moment of silence. Martha asked her sister how the reception had gone, as she knew that her sister always stood against the wall at receptions like this. Enrica looked at her sister in bewilderment. Martha smiled and said that she was just worried about her. Enrica looked closely at her sister as she saw that she had returned to her usual tone. Martha asked her sister with a grin if she had met the Duke. She wanted to know if he was nice to himself. Enrica sighed heavily and said that she didn't know, since she had never actually seen him. Martha sighed and said that she heard that the Duke had bought his entire family to take the place of the Grand Duke. Enrica looked away in my direction as her sister was trying to intimidate her, but she was no longer surprised. After all, she knew that in the bright future, he would kill his wife with his own hands. Martha was furious. She screamed that he was very cruel and terrible, that he liked to drink and beat women. Enrica smiled and said that she was fine. But Martha was furious. She didn't understand how her sister could be okay. She screamed that her family life would be just terrible. Enrica looked at her sister in bewilderment, as she did not understand what was happening to her and why she was suddenly angry. Martha screamed at her sister that she would share her bed with their bloodthirsty killer. She screamed that she would be beaten every day and asked her sister if she wasn't scared. The young lady looked at her sister in bewilderment and asked why she had suddenly become silent. Martha asked her sister if she had really been ignoring her. Enrica froze in place. She was surprised because she saw a young count behind her sister. Enrica was very puzzled, and at the same time surprised, as you all did not expect to see him. But the young man greeted her quietly with a smile. The young lady looked at her sister in bewilderment and asked what the strange expression on her face was, but the young man quietly gestured for her to be silent. Martha turned around because she thought her sister had seen a ghost. But a moment later, she herself froze in shock as she saw the young man. She screamed in fear and fell to the ground with a crash. She was trembling and could not utter a word. Enrica was surprised and wondered why her sister was so surprised. She looked at her in bewilderment as she thought that they knew each other since she was so scared. But the young lady could not utter a word. She looked at the young man with horror and fear. Kale came closer to the young lady and tenderly said that he missed her very much. She was surprised and embarrassed, but at the same time quietly asked why he came. He said that he had previously promised her to come. She was shocked, not understanding how he managed to get into their duchy at all. But he smiled and said that he entered through the main gate, and the guard was quite friendly. Kale extended his hand to the lady with a smile and said that they would not talk about it. Kale smiled and said that today was a great day for a walk. He asked if she would like to take a little walk in the garden. She smiled and agreed with him. She knew that if she lingered in the garden next to her sister, her father might notice her. Looking at her sister, she wondered if she should just leave everything as it was and go away. Marta was in shock. She did not understand how everything turned out this way, because she did not want this. She was in shock because she simply couldn't cope with jealousy. The young lady looked intently at her companion and called him. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked how he knew her sister, as she saw how surprised she was. He said that he saw her younger sister several years ago at one of the celebrations. She thought for a moment, knowing her sister's reaction had been too strong. The young man glanced sideways at the lady and asked if she really believed the rumors about the Archduke. Enrica looked away from him and thought for a moment. Raphael Kronhardt is an Archduke, but in fact there is quite a bit of information about him in the original. His past was a mystery, and there was no mention of his family. She knew he was a popular antagonist, but she found it hard to imagine him getting drunk and hitting a woman. Kyle looked closely at his companion and squeezed her hand tighter. She realized that she had been thinking too much, and her ex said that she did not believe in unconfirmed facts, which is why she did not avoid marriage. He looked at her in surprise, as he was taken aback by the answer. A moment later, he looked away from the young lady and said with a gentle smile that he understood her. She sighed heavily and said that if her father found out that she was going to refuse marriage to the Duke, he would probably get angry again. He looked at her closely and asked if this was the reason why she and the box suffered along with her. The young lady froze for a moment as he touched her tenderly. Kyle, looking at the young lady, said that he did not let her go home yesterday to see such a sight. Enrica looked away from him and asked timidly if he would believe that she had simply fallen and gotten hurt. He sighed heavily and said that if that's what she wanted, then he would do it. Enrica looked closely at her companion. She knew that she had been hit, but she did not understand why he was sad. He sighed heavily and said that this could not continue and that something needed to be done urgently. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was planning. At that very moment, he began to whistle. The Count looked at her with a smile and did not say that she should get into the carriage. She was in shock and did not understand what was happening. He sighed heavily and said that he was very surprised, and now he could not allow her to stay any longer in such a place, so he invited her to go to his house. The young lady froze in shock, as she did not expect anything like this at all. After a short argument, she told him that he hadn't even packed his things, but he just looked at her with a smile. A few seconds later, Sarah ran up to her and told her that she shouldn't worry about such things. Enrica looked at her maid in surprise as she was there with suitcases. Sarah said that she had packed her luggage. Enrica looked at the maid in surprise and asked if she hadn't gone out to get some cake. The young man looked at them intently and said with a smile that this issue had already been resolved. As he got into the carriage, he said with a satisfied smile that they could have already left. Enrica screamed that it was too unexpected, since they had only met yesterday. Kale looked at her closely and asked with a gentle smile, "What if she wasn't the first?" Enrica asked in surprise if he really meant to say that they had met before. Extending his hand, he said that she would gradually learn this if she agreed to be by his side. With the speed of lightning, the young man approached her and said with a smile that just as he needed her, she needed him. Some time later, the young lady slept quietly in the carriage as they made their way to the Earl's house. He hugged her tenderly, but she did not fall on his arm. Sarah looked at the young man intently, asking what he was thinking. She looked at him with a smirk and distrust and said that he took her with him, but he doesn't even know her. Kyle froze for a moment and remembered the recent situation. Because earlier, the young lady tearfully asked him to take Sarah with him. She looked at him intently and said that she had followed them because she believed that her lady should leave rather than remain in their duchy. She said that she did not trust him and therefore asked why he would deceive her in such a way as to force her to marry him, the Archduke. Kale looked at her with a fierce grin and said that it was very funny, and also asked if they were both deceiving each other. Looking at the young lady, he said that he did not think that the witch who was wanted throughout the empire had the right to say such a thing. Sarah was furious. She didn't understand how he knew about it, but he smiled and told her to be quiet, as her mistress might wake up. He looked at her closely and said he knew why she was worried. He said with a grin that there was no point in that, since he had no intention of laying a finger on the young lady. He looked at her intently and said that she was the only one who could save him. Some time later, they arrived at the Count's house. The young lady froze in surprise, as she had not expected to see anything like this. She was shocked, wondering how rich he was. She didn't know if a Count's mansion could be that luxurious. A moment later, the young man approached the gentleman and said that he urgently needed to tell him something about the recent and aspirations of the monsters. At the same time, the young lady admired the birds and decorations with admiration. Sarah sighed heavily and looked worriedly at her mistress. Enrica, in turn, the young lady asked the maid how she even knew that the Count was going to pick her up, since she came with her own luggage. Sarah looked at her mistress intently, not knowing what to answer. A few hours ago, you noticed a commotion in the Duchy of Sarah. The young man informed the gentleman that Lena was not in her room, but was in the garden, drinking tea with her sister. He quickly headed to the garden, but his subordinate was shocked and asked if he was really going to take the young lady away. He looked at his assistant with a smirk and asked if there was any reason why he shouldn't have done something like that. He said that he had already received permission from the Duke, while the young lady watched them closely. Looking at her mistress, Sarah said that she had one wish. She asked the mistress, but she could not listen to him. Enrica looked at her servant with bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. Sarah looked away from the young lady and asked her not to be angry with her. Enrica looked at her in surprise and asked why she was angry with her. Sarah glanced sideways at the Count, but said that something could have happened, and thus she could have lied or hidden something very important from the young lady. Enrica looked closely at her maid, as she understood that she was afraid that the fact that she was a witch would be revealed. Enrica looked at her maid and asked sadly what she was talking about. But a moment later, the young man came closer to them and with a smile apologized to the young lady for keeping her waiting. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had managed to settle all his affairs. He smiled and said that he had already settled everything and also offered her to go to dinner, as he assumed that she was probably hungry after a long journey. The young lady smiled and agreed, but as she left, she looked sideways at her maid, as she wanted to ask her more about this situation. At the same time, Sarah sighed heavily. She was puzzled because she understood that the lady could look at her with puppy eyes and ask how she could lie to her. Kyle looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if she liked the food. Enjoying her meal, the young lady smiled and said that everything was very tasty. The young lady sighed heavily and asked her companion if she could ask him something. She was puzzled and so timidly asked what the real reason was for him accepting her proposal. She smiled and said that it was very strange because he agreed to a fictitious marriage so easily, and this already made her wary. And she also wanted to know what his words meant when he said that he really needed her. After a few seconds, the young man stood there without saying a word. She looked at him in bewilderment, but he only came closer to her and looked at her with a satisfied smile. Kale tenderly asked for forgiveness in advance, and taking his companion's hand, placed it on his chest. She was shocked, as she did not expect such a thing. Looking at her companion with embarrassment, she said that she felt a little awkward since he had suddenly done something like that. But after a few seconds, she froze in place in shock. She was puzzled because she understood that something was wrong. He looked at her with a smile and said that he didn't know if she felt it, but he had no heart. Kyle looked at her tenderly and said that it was all because he was cursed. Enrica looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. He smiled with the same tenderness as before. But a moment later, he said that his body was now without a heart, and it was no different from a corpse, and now he was making it move by filling himself with magical power. He sighed heavily and asked if she remembered that he had previously told her that they had met before. She froze as she remembered what he had said at the reception where she first went after being reborn. He smiled and said that they had met at the ball and that he had been watching her from afar that day. He said with a smile that he experienced a feeling that was unfamiliar to him that day. He distinctly felt his heart, which he didn't have, begin to beat wildly. He was surprised, and therefore did not take his eyes off the young lady. The young man looked at his companion with a gentle smile and said that at that moment he realized something. He said tenderly that she was the only one who could reveal the truth about his curse. Enrica froze in place for a moment in surprise, but a few seconds later, she still asked in surprise what would happen to her if she couldn't free him from the curse. The young man, in turn, looked at his companion with tenderness, but a moment later, he said that if she couldn't deal with his curse within 1 year, he would die. Some time later, her young lady was lying in bed. She was puzzled and very sad as she recalled the conversation about this curse. Kale looked at the young lady with a smile, and the fact that he only had 1 year left because now his body had reached its limit, and unfortunately, he would not be able to make it move with your magic any longer. If she failed to dispel the curse during this time, he would die. She was furious because she knew she could lose him, but she didn't want to let that happen. Enrica was puzzled, introduced, and was only able to find a new friend. She understood that if he removed it, her father would definitely send her to the Duke, but she did not want to lose him at all. After all, she didn't want to leave him at all and abandon him while death was knocking at his door. But in turn, looking at the young man, she wondered if she could help him. She knew that the curse was probably related to magic, but unfortunately, she had almost no magic power left, so she didn't know what to do. But a moment later, she was taken aback as she remembered something very important. She remembered that the heroine from the novel was always with her magical creature, which took the form of a cat named Vermont. In an estate where no one understood the young lady, Vermont was the only one she could call a friend. According to the original, a magical creature could only return to the demonic world if the contract with its owner was broken or its owner died. Enrica knew that she was now weakened, but she was not dead yet, and she unfortunately did not remember the contract being terminated. She assumed that most likely it was somewhere in the Duke's mansion. She knew that, although he was a magical creature, he was still a real demon, and since he was a demon, lifting the curse would be a trivial matter for him. She knew that first she would need a carriage to return to the duchy. A moment later, she was taken aback and froze in place as she saw a young man. She looked at him intently, for she knew that he was the young count's assistant. With the speed of lightning, she approached him and asked for forgiveness for disturbing him. He sighed heavily and asked if something had happened. She looked at him with a smile and said that nothing of the sort had happened. She had just left something very important at her house, and so she asked if she could come back for something. At that very moment, the young man was taken aback and shouted that she would never leave the house. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she had not expected such a reaction. He spoke in a friendly voice, and with tears in his eyes, that the Agraf was currently on a campaign, and if he found out that the lady had disappeared while he was gone, you and your estate would definitely kill him. Enrica was taken aback and looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not expect that her companion was capable of such a thing, because he had always been kind to her. She looked closely at the young assistant and asked if there really was no way, but if she had simply forgotten something really important and wanted to pick it up. He froze in place from shock as he saw her beautiful puppy eyes that were begging him for help. Sighing heavily, he said that since it was a very important thing, then they could go together. She looked at him with a joyful smile and thanked him. Some time later, the young man informed the lady that they had arrived at the estate. She looked intently into the distance, as she had not expected to return to the estate the next day after her own escape. At the same time, Melua was anxiously shouting that she must return before sunset, without fail. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback, as she realized that she needed to hide so that the maids would not see her. A few seconds later, she was watching the maids closely from behind a tree. Enrica sighed heavily, because despite the fact that she had simply up and disappeared along with the Count, the atmosphere in the mansion had not changed at all. She understood that her sister had probably already told everything. After a few seconds, she looked away from the maids, but something else caught her interest. She turned her attention to her father's office and was taken aback as she assumed that the Duke would also be beside himself with rage, but for some reason he was very calm. She sighed heavily and wondered if no one really cared about the one that would remain hers. A moment later, she heard a noise, and looking closer, saw that the maids had happily approached the cat, who was sleeping quietly in the street as they thought he was very cute. Enrica looked into the distance and noticed that the cat was sleeping peacefully in the sun. The maid said with a smile that she had often seen him in the estate and was sure that he was very sweet and obedient. She slowly reached out to him, but at that very moment he hit her with his paw, and with the speed of lightning stood up and walked away. She was surprised since he was very small but brave. Enrica looked at the cat with admiration, as she was surprised that she found him so easily. She was clearly aware of the fact that she needed to follow him and not miss him. With the speed of lightning, she rushed after him, and at the same time did not forget to call him as an ordinary cat. She was puzzled because she did not understand where he was going. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback as she saw him stop and turn his head towards her. But at that very moment, he came into the room with the speed of lightning. She was surprised and therefore shouted for him to wait for her. The young lady froze for a moment, not understanding why he had entered this particular room, the room which had been abandoned for a long time, and they said that ghosts had even been seen. There was the room of the late Duchess. Enrica sighed heavily and looked warily into the distance as she realized that this room belonged to her mother. But she still dared to enter my room, and was taken aback for a moment as it was difficult for her to breathe, due to the fact that there was a lot of dust in the room. But after a few seconds, she was taken aback as she saw things unfamiliar to her. She assumed that they were intended for magical experiments. After a few seconds, she picked up the books that were lying on the table and noticed that there were the basics of teleportation, the art of summoning magic, as well as books that could be used to brew a potion. She was surprised because she saw that all the books were about magic. She was taken aback and wondered if the Duchess was a magician. Enrica sighed heavily, as it now became clear to her why the former Enrica, who was only a minor character, had a talent for magic. She realized that the young lady had inherited her power from her mother. A moment later, she was taken aback and looked up as she saw that there was a cat next to her. She looked at him alarmed and shouted at him not to touch the book, but it was all in vain as he shook it. She was shocked and screamed that he should stop, because the book was going to fall soon. But everything happened as she said, and the book fell right on her face. A few seconds later, she herself fell to the ground with a crash, but at the same time, the cat jumped off gracefully. Enrica looked at the small book with bewilderment. She did not understand whether she had a book or a notebook in her hands, but a moment later, she was taken aback as she saw an inscription that said that in front of her was the diary of Vivian Montemur. She was in shock, didn't understand what was in front of her, but at the same time, the cat was looking at her predatorily. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she didn't understand what was going on at all. A few seconds later, the young lady called the cat, but at that very moment, she heard some noise outside the door and realized that someone was coming towards them. The maid looked closely at her friend and asked in fear if she didn't know that they weren't allowed to enter the room of the late Duchess. She was frightened and said that she had definitely heard something when she passed by the room and could say with certainty that it was a woman's voice. A moment later, the maid opened the door to the room and told her friend to look around carefully as there was no one there. At the same time, the young lady ran out into the street in a hurry. Malua froze in place from shock and looked at the young lady in bewilderment, since I saw the state in which she came out to him. Malua asked in surprise if he was okay, but the young lady just laughed without answering. Enrica, in turn, was very happy because she knew that she was incredibly lucky since there was a large tree growing next to the window, and with its help, she could slip away without anyone noticing her. Malua. Looking at the lady, he asked if the thing she left behind was really a cat. Looking away from her companion, she said that she really wanted to take him since he was like family to her. She asked if she really couldn't take him with her. Malua, with a smile, said that it wasn't so, and the Count wouldn't mind that she brought him since he was so dear to her. After a short conversation, she got into the carriage to return back to the estate to the Count. She watched her companion closely as she simply grabbed him and brought him, but she did not know how she could be sure and assured that he was not an ordinary cat, but a familiar one. She decided to just start talking to him and greeted the cat with her gentle smile. Enrica looked tenderly at the cute fluffy cat because she saw that he was very cute. But a moment later, he looked at her with a predatory grin and asked why she was looking at him so intently. At the same time, he called her a fool with a fierce grin. Enrica froze in shock as she realized that her fears were not in vain. At that very moment, she was taken aback and screamed because she saw a talking cat in front of her. He sighed heavily and said that she shouldn't scream like that. And in general, he wasn't some kind of code, but Sir Vermont, and he said that she was just impudent since she didn't know anything like that. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked if this was true, and he was none other than Vermont. He looked at her intently and said in all seriousness that it was so, and he was the great Vermont who had lived for 400 years. Looking at the young lady, he asked in all seriousness what her name was. She was taken aback, and surprised asked if he really didn't know her. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked what made her think that he should know her. Vermont didn't understand what kind of self-confidence she had. Enrica looked at her companion in surprise, as she did not understand what was happening at all. She wondered if he really did not know the previous owner of the body, but she assumed that, most likely, this incident is connected with the fact that she ended up in this world. In a hurry, she said that he was in the Duke's house. She looked intently at her companion and said that she was the eldest daughter of the house, Vermont. In turn, casually said that he did not even remember the cheese, how long he had been in the estate, and the one who had summoned him had disappeared without explanation, so their agreement had long since become invalid. He sighed heavily and said that he assumed it was because the magic connection had weakened after the caster's disappearance, and unfortunately, he couldn't really remember the caster's face now. She sighed heavily and anxiously wondered what was going on. She understood that, for her, as the inhabiting soul, this was on the contrary, even convenient, since she did not need to explain all the circumstances. But he still looked at her with distrust. She understood that there was something suspicious about this. She knew she had never seen him before, but he was not a stranger to her. He looked at her closely and asked why she had taken him away from the mansion, since he understood that if she had come specifically for the demon, then she clearly wanted what you wanted. Enrica, looking at her companion, said that this was indeed the case. She sighed heavily and said that her fiancé had been cursed. She was very excited and puzzled, as she knew that she wanted to dispel this curse. She asked if he knew how to do something like this. He sighed heavily and said, of course. But a moment later, he looked at her intently and said angrily that he had no idea how to do such a thing. She was shocked, as she did not expect to hear anything like that. He shouted that no matter how powerful a familiar he was, someone else's curse could not be lifted so easily, and the fastest way was to turn to the one who cast the curse and try to negotiate with him. She was shocked and shouted that it was obvious, and if she had been given the opportunity, the person would not have asked her for help. She looked at him intently and asked if such a great demon, who had lived for hundreds of years, did not know any way to remove the curse. He sighed heavily and said that there were rare cases when, with the help of magical artifacts, it was possible to remove the curse. She looked with joy, but her new friend, as he finally began to say something useful. Vermont reported that many years ago, a man who angered the warlock was cursed, causing his body to rot. After a long search, he found a way to remove the curse with the help of a magical artifact in the form of scales, which was passed down in one noble family from generation to generation. He could help, but this magical item required a payment equal in value to the curse itself. But unfortunately, the man did not have anything valuable, and he had to sacrifice his eyes. He was eventually able to lift the curse, but he fell into despair over his blindness and soon committed suicide. Vermont said that he gave indirect involvement in the curse leads to an unhappy end. Looking at the young lady, he said that ideas are also better not to meddle where they should not, and as soon as possible, she should break off the engagement with her fiancé. She sighed heavily, but a moment later, looking at her companion, she asked which family owned the scales he had spoken of. He sighed heavily, and looking away from the young lady, said that they were now where they had just left. She froze in shock, as she did not expect anything like this. Some time later, they arrived at the mansion. Vermont, looking around, said with his smile that this was a pretty good mansion. He asked with a smile if this was really her fiancé's house, because the atmosphere there was gloomy, but such a mansion would be suitable for a comfortable life. Enrica was puzzled because she knew that this was simply a mockery of her, because she had managed to get out of her parents' house with great difficulty, and it turned out that she had a magical artifact in her house that could help remove the curse from her fiancé. She looked closely at her new friend and asked if he knew where exactly the artifact he had spoken of earlier was. He sighed heavily and said that he did not know the exact location, but the smell of the magical artifact that he smelled 100 years ago came from the mansion, and he suspected that the artifact was located there. But since this item was very important, it was hidden in a hard-to-reach place. Vermont said that now that he had long ago parted with his contract, unfortunately, his magic had weakened significantly, but as soon as he regained his strength, he would be able to pinpoint the exact location with this accuracy. But to do this, he would need to make a contract with a mage and be constantly under the influence of powerful magic. She looked at him with a smile and said that in that case, everything was simple, and he could make a contract with her. Vermont looked at her with disbelief and asked what she had just said. He sighed heavily and said that he had told her that he needed a strong magician, and with her skill, she wouldn't be able to lift a feather. Enrica sighed heavily as she remembered that she had lost all her powers. He looked at her intently and said that if she could break the magical shackles that were placed on her body, then perhaps they could make a contract. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. Vermont looked at the young lady in bewilderment and asked if she really didn't know about it. He sighed heavily and said that she hadn't lost her powers at all, but that someone had simply cast a spell on her body, causing the magic to be trapped inside her. Enrica looked at her companion in surprise and asked if this meant that if she could destroy the injections, she would be able to use magic. Vermont smiled and said that it was quite possible, and first she should look at the diary she had brought with her. Looking at the diary, he said that it emitted a scent similar to her magic. He smiled and said that most likely by reading it, she would find a clue on how to get her powers back. Sometime later, the young lady became intently engrossed in reading her diary. Enrica read that the young lady first met the Duke, and when other people found out she was a mage, they began to avoid her, considering it an ominous omen. But the Duke, on the contrary, said that it was very interesting and treated her with kindness. Enrica sighed heavily, as it was somehow strange for her to read about the first meeting of the Duke and Duchess. Enrica was taken aback when she read that her maid was very happy as she was going to marry the Duke. She was in shock and wondered if everything was happening too fast for them. She didn't realize how many days had passed and wondered if she had missed something. Enrica froze for a moment when she saw the small photograph. Viviane Montemor, the Marquise's daughter, the sorceress, and the Duchess. According to the diary, she complied with any of the Duke's demands and allowed herself to be used. She used magic to gain information and even harmed others. She was very kind and gentle, but every night she suffered from pangs of conscience. But she was still ready to do anything for the Duke whom she loved with all her soul, no matter what. But she did not even suspect the real tragedy that awaited her. Sometime later, she still managed to become pregnant by the Duke. She thought that he would always be happy, and next to him, the Duke. But unfortunately, everything turned out differently. She just wanted to live a happy life with her beloved and child. She was shocked and asked her husband what kind of relationship he had with the girl. He shouted and looked at her with contempt because he knew that they had just a marriage of convenience. He said that he did everything she wanted and even gave her a child. Looking at her with contempt, he said that she should not humiliate herself anymore. She was shocked, as she did not expect such betrayal from her beloved. Some time later, the woman gave birth to a child, and she was named Martha. The Duke was not shocked, as she knew that now the Duke was only concerned about his mistress and her daughter. But unfortunately, this suited her, as she just wanted her daughter not to be harmed. But a few months later, that woman died in an accident. The Duke was furious and decided that it was the Duchess who staged that accident with her magic. He kept her in a dungeon and beat her for several days so that she would confess. Sometime later, after all the manipulations on the part of her husband, her body became very weak and she felt that she did not have long to live. At the same time, she found peace in the thoughts of her sweet little daughter. She looked at her daughter with sadness and regret, because she knew that she was a very poor little girl, and she could not allow her husband to use their daughter for his own selfish purposes. With this, she decided to cast a spell on the rain. But on the day of her coming of age, the spell she cast that sealed her magical power faded. She was puzzled because she knew that with the amount of magic she had left, it was all she was capable of. But at the same time, she looked tenderly at her daughter and asked her to come closer. She hoped that if the time came when she really needed magic, she should use her power only for the one she truly loved and who loved her. The young lady in turn burst into tears after reading her mother's diary. She was in shock because she didn't understand why she was crying, because she wasn't even a real daughter to the late Duchess. The pain and terrible loneliness that she had to endure love for her daughter is all she felt. Enrica looked into the distance and told the Duchess that she need not worry since she was involved in her daughter's case and would no longer act at the Duke's behest. But after a few seconds, she was taken aback as she saw the light coming from the diary. She was in shock as she did not understand what was happening. The next day, she slowly opened her eyes. She wondered if she had passed out after reading the diary. At that very moment, Vermont ran up to her as he noticed that she had woken up. She looked at him in surprise, but he just looked at her with a predatory grin and asked what happened. He smiled and asked her if she had really regained her magical powers. Enrica froze for a moment and wondered if her power had returned. A moment later, and she actually felt the mana inside her body. She knew that her mana felt different. She wondered if she really had her powers back. At that very moment, she pounced on the demon and said that in that case, he should sign a contract with her. She asked if her strength was now enough for him. He was taken aback and told her to stop, since before that they needed to check something. Vermont looked closely at the young lady and asked if her goal was still the same. He asked if she really wanted to lift the curse from her fiancé. Enrica said that it was so, but at that moment she was taken aback and asked in bewilderment if something was wrong. He looked at her intently, but after a few minutes he turned around and said that in that case, he would not sign a contract with the line. She was in shock because she did not understand why he suddenly changed. As he left, he glanced sideways at her and said that he didn't want to get involved with something as sinister as a curse, and if it was about seizing the throne or a world state, then it would be a different matter. But if she wasn't going to change her goal, then he intended to return to the demon world. Enrica looked at him intently as she realized that he had decided to go a different route. Looking at the demon with a predatory grin, she said that she agreed with him and he could do as he pleased. A moment later, she asked with a smirk if he had enough strength to open the door back to the demon world. He froze in place for a moment. She smiled a gentle smile and said that he had told her this himself earlier, since in order to restore magical power, one must constantly be under the influence of the contractor's strong magic. She smiled and asked if that wasn't why he followed her. Enrica looked closely at her libertine and asked which of them was at a greater disadvantage. Vermont froze in shock as he didn't expect to hear anything like that from her. He hissed and asked angrily if she dared to threaten him. Stretching, the young lady asked what kind of threats she was talking about, since she had simply stated all the facts. As she left, she looked at him and said with a smile that he should think about everything again. He was furious, but he knew she was right. Some time later, the young lady was sitting with her fiancé in the garden drinking tea. He smiled and said that he had recently heard that she had brought home a cat while he was away. The Count smiled and said that he could not have even imagined that she had pets. She sighed heavily and looked at him with a smile, because she knew that in fact it was the familiar one who did not listen to her at all, and also his character was not very good. Kale looked closely at the young lady as he saw that she was excited about something. Although the young lady had regained her magical power, she had no idea what to do next, and all this time she was thinking only about this. She understood that she first needed to gather clues to find the magical artifact that was in her stepfather's house. She was taken aback because she was very immersed in her thoughts and did not notice when her fiancé approached her and began feeding her. But a moment later, she changed his face and with a smile told the young man that she would like to ask him for a favor. He looked at her with a gentle smile and said that he was listening carefully. Enrica looked intently at the young man and said that she really wanted to take part in the upcoming masquerade ball at the Marquis's house. He was taken aback and looked at her in surprise, as he had not expected anything like this at all. She looked at her companion with bewilderment, as she did not understand why he reacted so dissatisfied to her request. She sighed heavily and said that she would like to do this, but in turn asked if there was really some problem. Kale looked at her sharply and said that this was not the department's business. But in turn, he did not understand why she would voluntarily go to the battlefield among the nobility when she could stay in a cozy home. She sighed heavily as she understood that he would not agree so easily, but at the same time she looked in surprise at the small dessert that he carefully pushed towards her. She understood that she needed to quickly use her trump card. The young lady looked at her companion intently and asked for forgiveness. Looking away from him, she said that her father always told her this. Enrica said, puzzled and sad, that her father had said that women were not allowed to leave the house without permission, and so she could only assume that he was simply ashamed of her. She sighed heavily and said that it seemed she had overestimated herself, because she thought that since she had left her father's house, she could start a new life. He was taken aback and puzzledly said that he had not meant that at all. But a moment later, he looked at his companion with a smile and said that he could not stop her, and she had the right to do whatever she wanted. A moment later, the young lady put her face to the table and thanked him with a smile for his understanding. Kale looked closely at the young lady and said that since she was going to the masquerade ball, she would need a new outfit. He smiled and said that after dinner, they could go to the clothing store together. Sometime later, they arrived at the salon, and the young lady was taken aback as she realized that it was very expensive. Looking around, she asked her fiancé if he thought it was too much. He smiled and said that she should not worry about it and should just choose an elegant outfit for herself. The man with the speed of lightning rushed towards them and greeted them with a smile, and also said that he had been waiting for them very much since they had contacted him. Kyle looked at the man menacingly and coldly, but said nothing. A few minutes ago, Malua told the man not to ask about anything when His Grace arrived at their store, but the man was obliged to call the Duke Count, otherwise they would both be dead. The man looked intently at the Count and said that it was a great honor for him to see the young people in his salon. The young lady in turn, without looking at anyone, went into the depths of the store. She was taken aback and froze for a moment because she saw that there were many lovely outfits in the store, and she could not choose what she liked. He smiled and said that this was a very big problem and just a disaster. A moment later, the Count called the man and asked if he could recommend an outfit that would suit his bride, and with lightning speed, they shouted that they would arrange everything that very minute. A moment later, the man showed the young lady a very exquisite outfit and asked what she thought of it, because the master who made this outfit was from a distant country, and he sewed it with special care. Athena said that this shade would perfectly match her beautiful hair. She smiled and said that it seemed very beautiful, but a moment later, the Count stopped her. He looked closely at Madame and bombarded her with various questions. Discussing these outfits, Madame offered them different outfit options. The young lady was taken aback and told the young man that she was only going to buy one outfit. She didn't understand why she needed to look at several options. He smiled and asked what she meant. A few minutes later, he said that she should have at least 30 outfits in her wardrobe, and she should wear a new outfit every morning. She was taken aback by shock, as she did not expect this. Enrica was shocked and screamed that it was too much, and that one was enough for her, since she knew that for him it was a big financial loss. He looked at her with a smile and said that, to be honest, it was even beneficial for him. She looked at him with bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He looked at her tenderly and said that every time she puts on all the outfits, her thoughts will be only about him. Enrica froze and looked at her fiancé with embarrassment. She was very embarrassed, and she didn't even have anything to answer him, so she obediently accepted his conditions. Madame smiled and said that they bought all their outfits, and they would immediately send them to the mansion. Kale looked at his companion with a gentle smile and thanked her for supporting his idea. He also said that if she wanted, she could go out and take a little walk. In the meantime, he would pay and come for her. She smiled and thanked him. A moment later, the lady leisurely left the store. She froze at the entrance to the store, because she knew that in such an elite salon, he bought her 30 outfits at once. She was shocked and now realized that he was much richer than she had previously thought. She stood near the store and looked intently at the different outfits that were on display. But a moment later, she was taken aback and looked around as she heard her sister's voice. Martha looked closely at her sister and invited her to talk. Enrica looked at her sister with bewilderment, as she did not understand why she was in such a place. Martha looked coldly at her sister and asked what kind of questions she was asking, since she had said earlier that they needed to talk. She asked if she had come to the wrong place. Enrica, as she was leaving, said that they had nothing to talk about, so she was leaving, but Marta tried to stop her. Marta shouted to her sister and asked her to stop, as they had to talk, while she reached out to her sister. Enrica turned around and froze for a moment. At that very moment, she was taken aback as she found herself in the arms of her fiancé, and the young lady froze in shock as the knight's swords were pointed at her. Kale looked at the young lady with cold fury. She froze for a moment in shock and fear. He looked at her with anger and asked if she thought it was indecent to drag along the one who was already alone. She was taken aback and trembling with fear, and said that she would like to talk a little with her sister. Enrica was a little puzzled because she knew her fiancé was very angry, so she called him in a hurry. With the speed of lightning, she ran to her fiancé and hugged him, said that she would talk to her sister and later return to him, so he should not worry. He sighed heavily and asked if everything would really be okay with her. She smiled tenderly and said that it was true. Everything would be fine. He didn't need to worry. Enrica looked at the young man with a smile and asked if he could wait for her a little. He sighed heavily, but still agreed with her. Some time later, the young ladies were sitting in a cafe and sipping tea. Enrica, she looked at her sister and, sighing heavily, asked what she wanted to talk about. Martha looked closely at her sister and asked if it was true that she had not planned to return home. Enrica asked with a smirk if her father was really that angry. Martha looked at her sister and said that it was not so, and her father said that it was just an event that was supposed to happen, but it happened a little earlier. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Unfortunately, she felt sad at that moment, because he didn't even try to contact her even once. She wondered if he really just gave up on her just like that. Martha sighed heavily and told her sister that when she left home, she accidentally saw her diary. Enrica was a little surprised and puzzled, as she knew that the truth was that the owner of the body had described in detail everything she had gone through, how the Duke had mercilessly used her magical power, and how he had also used her as a simple slave. She described how she was constantly subjected to violence and humiliation on his behalf. Martha, shaking with fear, said that she didn't even know that her father treated her like that. Enrica sighed and looked at her sister, wondering if she had come to apologize. Enrica told her sister that she was just pretending not to know anything, and yet she was no different from their father, since she was the one who had been bullying her all along. Enrica, looking at her sister, said that it was she who had spread rumors about her among the servants, making an outcast out of her, and now she pretended to repent. Marta could not stand it, and with rage shouted at the young lady that it was because of her that her mother died. Enrica looked at her sister from the edge with bewilderment. Could she really mean the Duke's concubine? The young lady was taken aback and greeted him on the spot. She was shocked and did not understand how her sister could know about such a thing. Enrica sighed heavily as she realized that her sister knew that they were not biological sisters. She supposed that the Duke had probably told Martha that the Duchess was to blame for her mother's death, so it was only natural that she hated her. Marta was taken aback and looked at her sister with a sharp look in her eyes as she realized that everything was real and that she was an illegitimate daughter. In a hurry, she rushed to her sister and, taking her hand, taken aback, begged her not to tell anyone, because if anyone found out, it would be a disaster. Enrica pushed her sister away and quickly stood up. She looked at her intently and said that she was not a child anymore. She told her sister not to let her father manipulate her, and also she had to study and think for herself. Enrica, looking at her sister, said that it was always easier to blame someone else, but her mother's death was clearly an accident. As she left, she sighed heavily and said that they had nothing more to talk about, so she had to go. Martha was in shock. She asked her sister to stop. Marta sighed heavily as she did not have time to stop her sister. Time flew by very quickly, and soon the day of the masquerade ball arrived. Enrica looked closely at the maid and asked if she looked strange, as she felt awkward in this outfit. Sarah smiled and told her mistress that she looked beautiful, and it would be a shame not to show such beauty to others. Some time later, the young lady nevertheless went to meet her companion, who was waiting for her downstairs. The young man looked intently at his companion and called her with a smile as he realized that she was already ready. But when she came down to him, he froze for a moment, speechless. The young lady in turn looked at her companion with embarrassment. He froze for a moment and was taken aback as she was shining with beauty. A moment later, he backed away. She was in shock and ran up to him and asked if he was really ill. But he only said with a satisfied smile that when he saw her in such an outfit, his non-existent heart began to flutter. She was shocked by this. Enrica, looking away from her companion with embarrassment, realized that her maid was after all a master of her craft. Kale glanced sideways at the young lady and said that now he was even more reluctant to let her go alone. He asked if she was sure she wanted to go to the ball without a partner. She apologized, but she needed to resolve some personal issues. He sighed heavily and said that since she said so, apparently he couldn't do anything. Kale said with a smile that he would pick her up after the ball ended if she didn't mind. She smiled and said that she didn't mind. She would wait for him. Some time later, still tired of these, she arrived at the Marquise's house. She greeted the gentleman and a moment later left to go about her business. She knew that the ball was organized because the royal family wanted to show off the gift. This gift was presented in recognition of the merits of the Marquise family. However, by a twist of fate, the gift was stolen, and everyone was furious because the value was lost. The protagonist, who secretly met the lady at the masquerade, dropped his mask. He was furious because he did not understand what the man was saying. He claimed that they had corrupted him themselves. Burning with anger and fury, he shouted that the Marquis had resigned himself to desecrating the king's gift, and for this he would have to pay with his life. The Marquis backed away, and trembling said that it was not his fault at all, since the Marquise was supposed to look after the gift. The Marquise was in shock, but she could not utter a word. The prince said angrily that if this was so, then the Marquise would pay with her life, and at the same time the young lady tried to stop the prince. She looked at him intently and shouted that he had been too cruel to them. She begged him to forgive them for her sake. The prince looked at her in surprise, but taken aback, he nevertheless agreed. Thus, the Marquise became devoted to the girl who had saved her, and with tears in her eyes, she said that the young lady was now her benefactress. And at the same time, I realized that the plot is simply hopeless, since the main characters are such that it is not surprising that the antagonists are more popular. But on the other hand, she now had a chance to win the Marquise over to her side, making her loyal to her. A moment later, she approached the Marquise and said with a grin that she looked very gloomy. The Marquise looked at the young lady in surprise. Enrica smiled and told the Marquise that it looked like she needed her help. Enrica knew that the Marquise would agree to accept her help, since she knew who had stolen the gift. The Marquise was taken aback, and looking at the lady asked what she was talking about as she suddenly appeared next to her and began talking about help. At the same time, the young lady sighed heavily and left the banquet. She knew that she should not have taken part in the meeting at all, since today she too almost died from the nagging of the aristocrats. The Marquise was furious. She shouted at the young lady because she did not understand who she was and how she knew about her problem, burning with anger. She shouted and asked the young lady if she had any direct relation to this, that the reward was lost. Enrica sighed heavily and told the Marquise that she must not believe anything until she revealed her identity and status. A moment later, the young lady took off her mask and introduced herself with a smile, and also said that she thought she could find the lost thing. The Marquise was taken aback and froze for a moment in surprise. She did not understand how the young lady could help her. In a hurry, the Marquise asked the lady if she thought she would be a suspect in the main case. Enrica smiled and said that even if she was the one to blame for what happened, she would not have taken off her mask just like that. She smiled and said that she was standing in this place now because she had put the name of the duchy on the line. The Marquise stood frozen for a moment, not knowing what to answer. The Marquise looked at the young lady intently and said that she would believe her first, and if she somehow found the reward, she promised her that she would repay her with an appropriate price for her efforts. Enrica looked at the Marquise with a satisfied smile and said that she should wait exactly 1 hour. At the same time, a young lady was walking slowly down the corridor. She sighed heavily as she was very tired. She was puzzled because she knew she shouldn't have taken part in the festival, as she was mobbed by the aristocrat, and she was shocked because she was recognized even with her mask on. Sophia Wigrin was recently an ordinary and unremarkable daughter of a baron, but that was before she started a nasty affair with the second prince. All the misfortunes began on the day when the prince told her the following. He looked at her with a fierce deception and asked if she would become his beloved. Sophia was shocked by his statement, as he had not expected anything like this. He sighed heavily and asked if he was really so against it, as he felt a little uncomfortable. Fortunately, the prince's proposal was to pretend to be lovers in order to avoid the confrontation between the brothers, which had noticeably intensified recently. The prince informed the young lady that she was the most suitable person, as she was inconspicuous in his high society. He said that if he pretended to be attracted to her, whose status was not distinguished by anything, then he turned the brothers' standing a little weaker. She sighed heavily because she knew that this was true information, but still, she looked at him with bewilderment and asked why she should participate with her in such a dangerous matter. She did not understand what was good about having a pretend romance with him. He thought for a moment, as there was logic in her words. He looked at them intently and said that as payment for their cooperation, he would pay her 9 billion gold every month. She was taken aback and froze for a moment. The pretended relationship that began in this way went quite smoothly, but everyone was whispering because they did not understand what the prince was thinking when he got involved with such a worthless lady, but they saw that she was beautiful, so he tried to ask himself the question. The prince looked at the young lady with displeasure and said that her pretense was not very good because he had definitely told her to play the fool, but her facial expression now showed too much insight. Sophia was in shock. She screamed that, as he asked, she opened her mouth and looked with a soft gaze. He looked at her closely and said that she had opened her mouth too little. He sighed heavily and said that he meant that she should put more soul into acting. She was furious as he only angered her with his reproaches. Sophia was very annoyed because she knew that in reality this was nothing more and nothing less than bullying of a subordinate. She understood that she needed to tell him everything then, but she was still furious because she knew that she had a fragile character and she would not do this, although she wanted to express all the principles to her face at least once. But after a few minutes, all her thoughts disappeared as she became a witness to a very strange situation. At the same time, Enrica, with the speed of lightning, furiously pushed the Marquise to the wall and informed her that she had come to know everything. Sophia froze in place from shock, as she did not know who was in front of her. Enrica furiously shouted to the Marquise that if she did not want to see the disgusting sight, she must immediately confess where the gift was. Enrica screamed furiously and asked if she really needed to call her dark magician friend. She asked furiously if it was really her dream to go through such attempts. Enrica grabbed the Marquise by her necklace, while Sophia looked at the young lady with delight, as she too wanted to grab the prince by the collar. She looked at the lady with admiration as she realized that she was her ideal. Trembling with fear, the Marquise said that she did not know about any gift. She did not understand on what grounds they suspected her. Lady Brown was the culprit in the theft of the gift, and judging by the content of the book, she was a person with a greedy character and a bad habit of stealing. Enrica raised that if she dealt with that woman, she would be able to gain the trust of the Marquise. Enrica looked at the Marquise intently and said that there was reason, since she was the one who had an affair with the Marquise of Dyke. The Marquise froze in place in shock. A moment later, she could not stand it any longer, and angrily asked the young lady what nonsense she was talking about. Enrica looked intently at the Marquise and said that she had previously said that she had come because she knew everything. The young lady received the key to the Marquisate's vault from the Marquisate, and therefore stole all the valuables one by one. Enrica knew that if the Marquise, who had a strong sense of pride, found out the truth, she would not leave the young lady alone. Enrica looked at the Marquise with fury and said with a smirk that for her own benefit she should return the jewelry. Enrica asked with a fierce grin if she had any desire to return the gift as soon as possible. At the same time, the young lady observing this situation clapped while standing. The Marquise looked closely at the young lady and thanked her. She asked the lady how she could repay her, as she did not intend to forget her favor. Enrica smiled and said that she did not need to pay for such a thing, as she had done what she had to. The Marquise sighed heavily and said that she was very ashamed because she showed her weak side, and she could not have imagined that the culprit would be her mistress too. Enrica looked intently at the Marquis because she understood that she was in great shock because he was already a lover. She asked the Marquise what she would do. The Marquise smiled and said that first she needed to divorce him. Enrica looked at the young lady with admiration, as she had done, she would demand. The Marquise smiled and told the lady that she had previously heard that she had a weak and cowardly character, but seeing her in a different light today, she realized that rumors could not be believed. The Marquise asked the girl with a smile how she found out about the theft and helped her, since even she didn't know about it. The Marquise smiled and said that it seemed that her knowledge was on par with that of the Duke's future wife. Enrica froze for a moment, with a look of bewilderment on her face. Enrica was puzzled, as she thought that, by this time, the rumors about her quarrel with the Duke had spread in high society. The Marquise looked at the young lady in bewilderment and asked if she had not come today to celebrate with the Duke. After all, she knew that he was on the list of participants. She said that she definitely saw his name on the list. The young lady was shocked because she did not expect this. And at the same time, the young man of the Unhurried was getting ready. Enrica was puzzled because she knew that this simply couldn't be true. She was very scared and wondered if he was really at the party. She didn't know what would happen if she ran into him. Enrica was very nervous and wondered how she could get out of this situation. She understood that he could be in the banquet hall, so she could not go back. A moment later, she looked away to the terrace and realized that she could sit there for a while, and when everyone started leaving the event, she could blend in with the crowd and go out. She sat quietly on the terrace for a while, but after a long wait, she sighed heavily as she realized that she was very bored and needed to get herself something to drink. A few minutes later, the young lady looked at her hand in confusion, as she did not understand when the insect had managed to bite her. Enrica sighed heavily and looked closely at her hand, but a moment later, she was taken aback and froze in shock as she heard someone calling her name. She turned around hastily and wondered if it was Kale. The young man looked at her intently and asked if it was really she who was sitting on the terrace. Enrica was taken aback and froze for a moment as she realized that it was not him, and the man's voice was very low, but it was darker and of the group. Enrica was left in shock, wondering if it was the Duke himself standing in front of her. She was very scared, so she just watched the young man intently with horror. A moment later, she timidly asked if it was the Duke who was behind the door. But at the same time, the young man looked at her intently, but did not answer. After a few seconds, he said that it was true. She froze in horror on the spot. His voice was like a tidal wave, a flood of emotions that Enrica had experienced in the last moment of her life. A terrible pain that seemed to break through the heart, a desperate unwillingness to live regret stronger than all the pain. She was terribly scared and didn't know what to do. She understood that the cat would hardly leave her alive. She ran away from him and turned down his marriage proposal. A moment later, she called him and asked for forgiveness. He was taken aback and looked at her with bewilderment at such a reaction. A moment later, she began to tremble with fear, but at the same time, she was overcome with hiccups. Enrica was a little puzzled as she understood that he would have thought that she would be crying now. This frightened Enrica even more, because she knew that she would not tolerate the annoying sounds of crying. He looked at her intently and called out to her, asking why she was so eager to appear before him. She was shocked because she translated that there was no time for this now. She wanted to go up to him right now, kneel down and beg for his life. Therefore, at that very second, she shouted that he should wait, as she would immediately come out to him. With lightning speed, she rushed to the door, but she froze when she saw that there was no one behind the door. Enrica ran out of the hall in a hurry. She was glad that she ran into the Archduke, but she was still puzzled because she did not understand why he had disappeared so suddenly. She froze for a moment when she saw all the aristocrats come out into the street. She wondered if any of the royal family was planning to leave, but a moment later, she saw her groom in all his glory. She ran up to him in a hurry and asked why he was at the banquet. He smiled and said that he had told her earlier that he would come to pick her up. She looked at her fiancé in surprise, as she did not understand why everyone was suddenly whispering while looking at them. She looked back in bewilderment as he hugged her, and a moment later said that they should go home first. Enrica, in turn, thanked him for coming to pick her up, but she did not understand why he had come to the front door, as she was worried that he might run into the Duke. He sighed heavily and told them that he thought so, that he shouldn't have come at all. She sighed heavily and, looking away from him, said that it was the best decision. Enrica said, puzzled, that there was a need to show the aristocrats that they were now together. She said sadly that earlier the Marquise had told her some nonsense about her becoming a duchess after all. She looked at her fiancé with bewilderment, as it was said that he was very sad about something. A moment later, Enrica was taken aback and quickly asked in surprise if he was really crying. Kale, looking away from the young lady, said sadly that it was true that there was something that made him want to cry, but he would not do it. She was in shock and wondered if something bad had happened. In the meantime, Enrica smiled nervously and asked if he had missed her so much that he wanted to cry now. He thought for a moment, but after a few seconds, he timidly said that perhaps that was so. She looked closely at the young man, because she knew that he was not like that at all. After a few seconds, she was taken aback, as she realized that this was a very serious situation. She was in shock as she understood that she needed to do something to improve his mood. A moment later, she looked intently at her companion and hastily said that she had something interesting to show him. He looked at her in bewilderment, but the young lady did not despair. She knew that she needed to focus and remember the feeling that day. After a few seconds, she used her magic. The young man was shocked because he did not expect to see anything like this. She looked at him with a smile and said that she had succeeded, and also asked if he was surprised. She smiled tenderly, looking at her companion, and said that in fact she knew how to use magic. Enrica said with a smile that she had lost her strength for some time, but had recently been able to restore it. Kale looked at her strength with admiration, as he knew that the sight was truly amazing. She smiled and said that she thought it would help him since she really wanted to break his curse. She said with appearance in her voice that she tried her best. He looked away from her embarrassed and said that he had no idea that she thought of him to such an extent. Enrica asked with a smile if it was not natural. She smiled and said that even if it was not real and temporary, he was still her fiancé, and just as he did everything possible for her, so she intended to do everything possible to dispel his curse. Kale froze in shock, as he didn't expect to hear anything like that. He stared at her small flashes of magic, but said nothing in response. At the same time, the young lady looked at him intently. He became tired and said that meeting her was a stroke of luck, the likes of which he had never had and never would have. Some time later, the young lady noticed that they had arrived back in the county. Enrica looked at her fiancé with bewilderment as she noticed that he was sleeping. She was taken aback when she saw him muttering something in his sleep. But after a few seconds, she was shocked by the sight, as she saw that he was crying in his sleep while muttering something inaudibly under his breath. Enrica was shocked because she saw his sleepy delirium and wet eyes. With the speed of lightning, she sat closer to him. She had a strange feeling from the sight of the sleeping young man, and from that recent expression on his face, as if he was about to burst into tears. Kale, whom she knew had always been free at heart, and now he easily showed his weak side in front of her. Enrica looked at the young man with sadness. She couldn't resist and touched his head. Enrica looked at the young man and thought for a moment, since she really knew nothing about him, neither about the county nor about Kale. She wanted to ask when she would have a similar chance later. With a slight smile, she looked at the young man and said that it was time for him to get up, as the servants were already waiting for them. She reached out to him to wake him up, but he suddenly grabbed her hand and at the same moment threw her onto the chair. She was for a moment better for now. The young lady stared at the young man for a moment without saying a word, but after a few seconds, she still called him, and she saw his beautiful eyes, which were filled with surprise, from which fresh tears were still dripping. Kyle immediately approached the young lady, and with a smile called her embarrassed. He touched her face tenderly and brushed her hair away. A moment later, he asked sadly if this was a dream. She was shocked, but shouted that it was not so. After a few seconds, they were both confused. At the same time, the young lady wondered if he was half asleep. Milua approached the carriage and asked the Count if something had happened to them, since they had not come out for a long time. When he opened the carriage doors, he saw a truly amazing sight. The young man froze for a moment, not expecting to see anything like this. Milua hastily asked for forgiveness. As he had disturbed the young people, Enrica was taken aback and shouted that he had misunderstood everything, but it was all in vain. A few days later, she received a letter from the Marquise, who thanked her for her help, and the Marquise also asked the young lady if she would have time, as she wanted to drink tea with her, Enrica. In turn was very happy as the Marquise invited her to the mansion. Marchioness Dyke, from a respected knightly family, underwent all sorts of difficult training in her youth, and after retiring, she pacified even high society. Enrica understood perfectly well that after the theft incident, she had won her interest, but in turn, Naledi wondered whether she would truly become her reliable support. He looked at her intently and said that first the ball, and now an invitation from the Marquise, and judging by the bottles as she went about having fun, it seemed that she had already refused the groom. Enrica smiled and said that he did not understand anything. She looked at her friend intently and said that this was all her big picture to save her fiancé. He looked at her skeptically and asked if she really thought that she could dispel her fiancé's curse, even without him. The lady looked closely at her friend and, sighing heavily, said that this was not so. She smiled tenderly and said that all she could do now was show her mana. Enrica, in turn, was very glad that she didn't have to use magic last time, but she knew that now there was no guarantee that everything would be resolved like that time. She smiled, looking at the cute cat, and said that she really wanted to get her power back too. She said with a smile that if he understood her, then she thought that she could do everything. He sighed heavily but did not answer. But a moment later, he took off a cute bell from his bow and threw it right in the young lady's face and shouted that he didn't like her. She was shocked because she didn't expect such a thing. Vermont shouted that he didn't like the fact that she was rushing to help her lazy fiancé when she herself was weak. He also didn't like that she had no interest in conquering the world, even though she had summoned a great demon. As he left, he shouted that for this reason she should not press on his pity. The young lady was shocked, she called him, but it was all in vain. She froze in place from shock and surprise, as she did not understand what had happened at all. Sometime later, the young lady did visit the Marquise's mansion. She froze for a moment, as she had not seen the place during the ball, but she noticed that the mansion had a well-decorated backyard. Looking around, she realized that it was not as luxurious as her fiancé's mansion, but it was still quite charming. A moment later, the young lady, looking back, accidentally stumbled and was taken aback as she realized that she was falling. But at that very moment, the young man managed to catch her with ease. He looked at her with a smile and called out. The young man smiled tenderly at the young lady and asked if she was hurt. With the speed of lightning, she pulled away from him and, taken aback, said that she was fine, and also thanked him. Enrica was a little puzzled because she did not know who was in front of her, but a moment later, she felt a sharp pain in her leg. She sighed heavily as she realized that she had tripped when she fell. He looked at her closely as he noticed that she had a wound on her leg, and at that very moment, he quickly grabbed her and lifted her into his arms. She was in shock as she did not expect this. Enrica cried out in confusion and asked what he was doing. The young man smiled and said that he was helping a wounded man because it was his duty as a knight, so she could get comfortable in his arms. She was shocked and knew that she had never done something like this, even with the groom. He smiled and asked where she was going, as he intended to take her there. At the same time, the Marquise rushed towards them. She looked at him with fury and asked if he had really started up again. Tristan froze in place for a moment, but after a few seconds, he easily let go of the young lady, and she landed on the ground with the speed of lightning. The Marquise sighed heavily and told the young lady that she was very ashamed in front of her, and therefore she thought that today it would be better for her to go back and rest the Marquise. Also told the young lady that she wanted to ask her about many things. The Marquise looked at her brother with fury and asked what he had done to put the dear lady in such a state. Tristan smiled and said that he had only helped the young lady when she accidentally got hurt. In turn, Enrica looked at the young people with bewilderment, since she did not know what kind of relationship they had. because the Marquise now looked very unhappy. Enrica smiled and asked the Mark and why she wanted to ask her. The Marquise in turn hesitated and said that she did not want to know anything special. She said that when the ball was over, a man came to her who was very anxious to see the young lady, and he asked her to arrange a meeting between them. Enrica looked at the Marquise in surprise and asked who the man was. She wondered if it was the Archduke himself. The Marquise smiled and said that a young lady named Sophia wanted to meet her. Enrica was taken aback for a moment and stood there in bewilderment. She was shocked and did not understand why the main character of the novel wanted to see her. She wondered if the main character knew what she was getting herself into. The Marquise said with a smile that the young lady had spoken incomprehensible words like, "He fell in love with her unbending will at first sight." The Marquise smiled and said that she felt uncomfortable, so she began by saying that they were not very familiar. Enrica, in turn, thanked the Marquise because she knew that she had chosen the right words. Enrica sighed heavily, and since it was difficult for her to avoid the Duke, she did not want to get involved with the main character, who together with the immature prince was causing trouble. Tristan approached the young lady with a gentle smile and said that she had a talent for attracting a person's attention at first sight. He tenderly said that he would now be her escort on the way back. Enrica froze in place in shock and embarrassment, as she did not expect this. But at the same time, the Marquise screamed furiously at her brother and demanded that he take his hands off the young lady immediately. She looked closely at her brother and asked if he really thought that she didn't know what he was up to. The young man was taken aback and looked at his sister in bewilderment. A moment later, he said that this time everything was really wrong. Enrica, in turn, looked at the young people in bewilderment, since she did not understand what they were talking about. But at that very moment, the young Marquise grabbed her friend and said that it was time for them to go. She glanced sideways at her brother and told him to move away from them. She informed her brother that she would certainly accompany the young lady home in a carriage. Enrica looked at her new acquaintance with bewilderment and asked if there was really any need to be so angry, since her brother only wanted to help her. The Marquise sighed heavily and said that he was her brother, but it was still better for the young lady to stay away from him. Enrica was surprised by such a statement and asked why she should do such a thing. At the same time, she glanced sideways at the young man. Mariquisa sighed and said that her brother was a rare and debauched person. She looked closely at her brother and said that he had had affairs with more than hundreds of women. Some time later, the young lady finally arrived at the Count's castle. She thought for a moment about what the Marquise had told her, as she had thought that her brother was simply a friendly person. She wondered if the Marquise had been mistaken about something. She understood perfectly well that in a family, people usually judge each other very callously. A moment later, she looked at the man who called her with bewilderment. He sighed heavily and said to the young lady that young Master Tristan had asked her to give her a bouquet and a small note. He wrote that he wanted her to remember this flower instead of her injured ankle. She sighed heavily as she realized that the Marquise's words were most likely true, and now she understood why she had been so worried. She looked at the flowers she had been given with tenderness and embarrassment. Kale approached her and asked with a smile what kind of flowers she had in her hands. He also noticed a small note in her hand. Kale looked at his companion sullenly, as he really didn't like everything. He looked at her intently, and with a gentle smile, asked if she had really started a love relationship with someone while he was gone. The young lady in turn pulled away from her companion and said with a smile that everything was not so at all because she had gone to visit the Marquise and had gotten a little hurt there. And as an apology, she was presented with flowers. Kale was taken aback and asked the young lady if she was hurt. He shouted that she should show him her injury. She smiled and said that nothing special had happened and that she had only slightly sprained her ankle. At that very moment, the young man grabbed the young lady in his arms, and she consoled him in a way she had not expected. She sheepishly told her companion that there was no need for this, since it was enough that he could support her by the arm. She was in shock. I didn't understand why everyone was lifting her up in their arms today. Kale sighed heavily and said that if she didn't want to, then he couldn't do anything, but he would still have to ask the Marquise to take responsibility for the fact that she couldn't protect her. The young lady was taken aback and said that she understood everything. But after some time, she sighing heavily, asked if he thought it was strange. He looked at her in bewilderment, as he did not understand what she was talking about. She looked intently at her companion and said that the Marquise still believed that she would become the Duke's wife. Enrica asked the young man if the Marquise had not heard the news that she was now with him and not with the Duke. He sighed heavily and said that the Marquise was a man who was not initially interested in rumors. Enrica sighed heavily and said that the Marquise, who was at the head of high society, could not help but know about this. He was taken aback because he did not know what to answer her. But a moment later, the young lady Sama was taken aback as she noticed that everyone was staring at them. She was very embarrassed and ashamed of the fact that he was carrying her in his arms. He smiled and said that she should not hide her sweet face. He said with a smile that if the servants behaved rudely, then he would apologize for them. But such a scene was rare in this house, so they were very interested. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really talking about the fact that he simply held her in his arms. He smiled and said that, to be more precise, he was talking about the scene of him talking to someone while smiling. After some time, they were already in the young lady's room. Kale looked at her with a smile and said that she should rest properly before dinner, and he also wanted to send a doctor to examine her ankle. But at the same time, the young lady was immersed in her thoughts. She was surprised by the fact that the servants did not see him talking to anyone while smiling. She wondered if members of her fiancé's family did not pay visits to the mansion. The young lady looked timidly at her companion, and asking for forgiveness, called him. She timidly asked if he had been alone in the mansion before she arrived. She said that she had not heard anything about his family or any relatives either. Kale Q looked down as he clearly understood that the story was not very pleasant. He looked at her intently and asked if she really wanted him to answer honestly. After a few seconds, he approached the young lady very closely and heavily sighing, and saying that most of his family members had died. The young lady froze in place in shock. The previous Archduke Kronhard was a man who had many wives. Among them was Raphael's mother, who was a mistress without any power, surrounded by women who wanted to make their child an heir. While pregnant, she drank tea sent by another wife and quickly became weak. She barely managed to protect and give birth to a child, but she had to close her eyes, never being able to hold him. Then the maid hurriedly shouted that the child had not cried at all, and that she had not felt a pulse either. They were in shock and wondered if the child had really died. She screamed that it wasn't so because he was breathing weakly, but still definitely. At a time when no one knew what to do, a man came whom everyone knew as a dark magician, but no one knew his name, and told everyone that the child was cursed. He looked at everyone present with a predatory grin and said that if the young boy was left without attention, he would soon die. He said that only he and no one else could save the child, so he demanded that the child be handed over to him immediately. The previous Archduke didn't care about the child. His mistresses and maids, who had no alternatives, ended up handing him over to a dark magician. Thus, Raphael Kronhard grew up as a test subject for a dark magician. He suffered and had nosebleeds from all sorts of experiments. It was common to lose consciousness from the pain of his splitting head. Just when he thought it couldn't get any better, the poppy filled the boy's heart with mana, so he brought him back to life again. But no matter how much water you pour into a cracked pot, it will eventually break. He thought that 20 years was the limit, and if the boy was lucky, he would live for a few more years. Eventually, suffering terrible pain, when he turned 10, the young boy protested to the dark magician for the first time. He screamed that such a life was unbearable, so he asked the magician to kill him. But the man only looked at the boy with a fierce grin and said that everything was right and the time had already come. He looked at the boy intently and said that he would bring him back. The man smiled and said that he was interested in him because he was curious about how his damn life would end. He knew that most likely his life would become a terrible spectacle, the likes of which the world has never seen before. He said with a fierce grin that he would give him freedom so he should live. He looked closely at the little boy and said that he had to work hard to live. Some time later, the boy was brought to the Duke's mansion, after which the Duke carried out a quick checkup procedure and accepted him into the family. He saw the existence of a family he had never thought about before. He was provided with a soft bed and their hot food. He did not even have time to be confused by the sudden luxury he received, because after some time, the first attempt to kill with poison occurred. He was very surprised since this situation was unexpected for him, but he knew that it was even better this way, since he was used to this kind of thing. As a little boy, he faced assassins and poisons sent by his brothers every day. On the street, he bribed a magician and replenished the mana in the decaying body. Holding his breath, he was patient and quietly grew his power in the duchy. At the moment when everything was ready, he launched a counterattack. The first to leave this world was the elder brother, who mixed poison into him, died after drinking tea. The second elder sister, who was constantly sending assassins after him, died in an accident. When the time came for the third brother, he, without even thinking of hiding it, set an example for everyone. There were rumors that a curse had been placed on the duchy around the time the remaining brothers themselves left the domain. In the end, he sent his father to the next world with his own hands. The dark magician's words about the terrible spectacle that would be unseen before were true. In the end, he thought that he could not do anything to counter the words about the curse, until he met the one who made his heart howl. Until that day, he thought that his heart was completely empty, but he realized that he was wrong. He sighed heavily and said that most of his family members had died. The lady was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. She was puzzled and simply remained silent. Enrica saw that the young man had pulled away from her and asked for forgiveness, because she now realized that she had asked such a question in vain, but he did not answer. A moment later, he said that it would be better for her to have dinner alone tonight, because he suddenly had urgent business. As he was leaving, he said that they would see each other later. She was shocked and asked him to stop. She asked him to stop several times, but it was all in vain. Enrica was shocked because she realized that this was a big problem. She knew that he usually dined with her despite his busy schedule, but she ended up dining alone. She was very nervous because she realized that she had made a huge mistake. She knew it wouldn't work, and she needed to do it urgently. Sorry to him, so she ran quickly to his office. But a moment later, she froze in place when she heard her fiancé talking to his subordinate. The young man said that a few months ago, the young lady said that she was very ill. Kale looked closely at his subordinate and told him to find out about everything, as he wanted to know if she remembered about that time. She froze for a moment in shock, and listening to their conversation, wondered if they were talking about her. He looked at his subordinate intently and told him to question the people close to him who had had contact with the young lady. But a moment later, he looked at his subordinate and gestured for him to remain silent. At the same time, the young lady froze in place as they fell silent. At the same time, the young man moved away from his subordinate and rushed to the door. With lightning speed, he opened the office door. But after a few seconds, I saw that there was no one behind the door. Malua looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if there was really anyone there. The Duke sighed heavily and said that there was no one, and also leaving, he invited his subordinate to continue their conversation. At the same time, the young lady sat quietly behind the door, using her magic. After some time, she rushed to her room in a hurry. She was very excited and scared, because she knew everything was very strange. She remembered the cold expression on his face when he told her about the death of his family. Now she heard his indifferent voice when he spoke about her. She was very scared, because this was the first time such a thought had entered her head. She was shocked because she realized that, perhaps, he had a completely different face. She was shocked because he had never shown her such an expression on his face before. The next day, Sarah looked at her mistress in surprise and asked why she was in such a state. The young lady only laughed without answering, as she ended up not being able to sleep due to her long thoughts. Sarah sighed heavily and told the young lady that she needed to get her hair done. She looked closely at her mistress, who looked very tired. A moment later, the young lady looked away at the small bouquet of flowers next to her. Enrica looked at her maid and asked if she by any chance knew Tristan Dyke. Sarah smiled and asked if there were any women in the kingdom who did not know this name. Enrica looked at her servant with a smile and asked what she was talking about. Sarah smiled and said that the young man was famous for having joined a knightly order at the age of 18. But later rumors spread that he was expelled because he had been walking with a nun for a year. The maids of noble families' daughters said that there was no woman who would not fall under his spell. Sarah looked closely at her mistress and said with a smile that she did not need to worry, because if such a libertine approached her, she would never leave him alone. Enrica sighed heavily and thanked her maid for her concern. She was shocked, because she didn't think at all that he was like that. She understood that you can't judge a person by his appearance. Enrica, in turn, understood perfectly well that she should under no circumstances get involved with him. But a few seconds later, she was taken aback and froze in shock when she saw a young man on her terrace. She froze, not understanding whether this was a dream or reality. But the young man looked at her with a radiant smile and greeted her with a gesture. She quickly closed the window in a hurry. Sarah looked at her mistress in bewilderment, as she did not understand why she was behaving in this way. A moment later, the young lady called out to her maid that she would go out for a moment. Sarah looked after the young lady in bewilderment, but unfortunately, she did not have time to say anything to her. Some time later, she finally met the young man. Tristan smiled and told the young lady that he was very glad that they saw each other again. She was shocked because she did not understand how he knew about this place. Out of breath, she asked how he had originally entered the mansion. He smiled and said that he had asked the coachman for the address and that he had entered the mansion through a loophole in the forest. She was shocked as she realized that there was a loophole in the mansion that she had never heard of. He smiled and apologized because he knew it was impolite, but he was still very worried about her injured leg, so he could not resist and ended up right under her window. Enrica was in shock. She screamed and pushed him because she knew that he had to leave, because if someone saw that he was here, trouble could not be avoided. She wanted to send him away quickly, as she was already worried about the incident with her fiancé. But the young man turned around and, looking at her with a gentle smile, called out. He sighed heavily and asked if something was bothering her. She froze in place for a moment. He looked at her closely and said that her face looked rather gloomy. He smiled at Tristan and said that his special talent was reading the expressions on women's faces. She looked at him skeptically, but did not answer. Tristan looked at her closely and said that if she had any worries about anything, she could tell him, because if she told an unknowing third party, she would feel better. He looked at her closely and said that perhaps he could help her with something. She sighed heavily as she understood that she still needed his help. He looked at her closely with a gentle smile and asked if after her story, she was really sure that one of her acquaintances was hiding something from her, and she was worried because she did not know what exactly he was hiding. She sighed heavily and said that if you sum it up, then everything was exactly like that. Tristan looked away from her with a smile and into the distance. But a moment later, looking at the young lady, he said that since she was upset about this fact, then he could resolve her situation and help her. She looked at him in bewilderment for a moment. He smiled and said that she should go with him to one place. Some time later, they came to a nondescript house. Tristan smiled and said that he brought her to the best guild in the kingdom, which provided various information, and he could say with confidence that there was no information that had not already been found out here. She was shocked, wondering if such a place really existed. Entering the guild, she was taken aback, as the atmosphere somehow filled her with fear. A moment later, the young lady screamed as the young man suddenly stood up and walked towards them. The man approached the young lady's companion with lightning speed. She was frightened and did not understand what was going on. But after a few seconds, the man's expression changed, and he greeted guild leader Tristan with a joyful smile. Enrica froze in shock for a moment and looked at her companion in surprise. She looked closely at the young man, as she had not expected to hear anything like that at all. Looking at Tristan, she wondered if he was really the guild leader. The man looked at the young man intently and asked how he could leave everything to him and then just disappear. Tristan smiled and told his subordinate that he respected him very much and trusted the entire guild. The man sighed heavily and said that the last time they saw each other was the day he was almost executed for trying to elope with the princess of a neighboring kingdom. The young lady looked at her companion in shock, as she had not expected to hear anything like that. The man smiled and said that he had also tried his best to find a way to get out of that mess. And it turned out that it was only yesterday Tristan looked at the man closely and asked him to close his mouth with a smile. Carl looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was his new companion. Enrica was shocked and said that this was not so. But a moment later, she looked away and saw her sister. She was shocked because she did not expect to see him in such a place. With the speed of lightning, the young lady hid behind her friend. Enrica was shocked. She didn't understand what her sister was doing in such a place. Sometime later, some of them went upstairs into a small office. Carl looked closely at the young lady and asked who exactly she wanted to gather information about. Tristan smiled and said that he was the same person who was keeping something secret from her. Initially, she really wanted to know all the information about her fiancé, but she was not too comfortable discussing it with Tristan because he is also an aristocrat. But unexpectedly, for the young people, she said that she would like to receive information that directly concerned her sister Martha. Enrica sighed heavily and said that she had turned a blind eye to her father, using her and torturing her, and she had just seen her sister leaving the guild. She wanted to know what her sister had planned this time. The man was taken aback and said that the details of the request were confidential. Tristan looked at the young man intently, and he in turn said that it was not very important. He looked closely at the young lady and said that she wanted to know whether Archduke Kronhart and Lady Winterroar would be attending the upcoming hunting party. Carl glanced sideways at his subordinate and asked if there was any more information she didn't want to know. He sighed heavily and said, puzzled, that she had also asked to get the seating plan for the guests, and then he said that she should come in a few days. Enrica was worried because her sister wanted to know about the hunting technique, but more than that, she wanted to know if her sister and the Archduke would be there. The young lady was shocked. She did not understand what her sister was planning at all. Some time later, they left the guild. And looking at the young lady, the young man said that she did not need to worry, because if her sister appeared in the guild again, she would not receive any information. Since he ordered not to give her anything concrete, and they should send her back, she looked at him in surprise and thanked him. A moment later, the young lady looked at him tenderly and said with a smile that she would not forget his help today. She said with a smile that she would certainly return to the estate and pay him a fair price for the information. He smiled and said that she did not need to pay. Looking at the young lady, he asked if she could become his girlfriend instead. She froze for a moment in surprise, as she had not expected such a thing. But after a few minutes, she said that she could do it. She knew that it was very suspicious, but still he helped her a lot. Tristan smiled and asked if she wanted to go for a walk together. She was surprised because she didn't understand where he wanted to go. As he left, he said with a satisfied smile that there was one place he had always wanted to go with a friend. Sometime later, they came to the night market. Enrica was amazed because she did not know at all that there was such a place in the city. He looked at her with a smile and asked if she liked something like that. She was shocked because he started talking to her informally. Tristan smiled and said that speaking too formally in a place like this might attract attention. And besides, they were friends now, so it wasn't a big deal. She looked at him in surprise, but still agreed. She was in shock. She did not understand why she had such a feeling that she was being pulled deeper and deeper. Some time later, they were walking through the night market and eating various snacks. They also admired the beautiful flowers that were at the night market. Some time later, they tried on various exquisite headdresses. After some time, they came to a fortune teller. She smiled and asked the young lady if she really thought she wasn't human at all. Enrica looked away from the fortune teller in confusion as she realized that she was a very perceptive person. She looked closely at the young lady and asked why she still felt guilty for taking what was someone else's when it had always been hers. The young lady looked at the fortune teller in bewilderment as she did not understand what was being discussed. The fortune teller smiled and told the girl that she should treat the man who was next to her well because he was the one who was ready to give his life for her at any moment. Enrica asked the fortune teller in bewilderment if she was really talking about Tristan now. Tristan smiled and said that her predictions were accurate. The lady looked at the young man intently frowning. A moment later, she asked the young man to extend his hand to her. She was shocked because she saw a lot of women in his life. She sighed heavily and said that he had many women, but it seemed that he never knew what true love was. And if he did not stop living a depraved life, then he could forget about marriage. She looked at him intently and said that if he didn't want to be alone all his life, he had to be honest with himself first. Enrica looked at Madame with puzzlement, as she knew that her words sounded like a curse. She stood up in a hurry and said with a smile that it was time for them to go, but they were still glad that they came to see her. Some time later, they were walking through the city at night. The young man looked closely at his companion and asked if something had happened. He wanted to know if she was interested in what the fortune teller had said. Enrica sighed heavily and said that the lady had said such things right in front of a man, and she felt awkward. He looked at her hard and said that it wasn't entirely untrue. Tristan said that he was born into an old-fashioned knightly family, and he had to pretend to be the perfect knight all his life. But at some point, he wanted to get rid of it. He looked intently at his companion and said that if the prediction was the price for freedom, then he was ready to pay it. She sighed heavily, because she knew that he had led a life he did not want, for the sake of his family, and his situation reminded her of Erica before her transformation. She looked at the young man with a smile and said that he was a good man, because it was better to be a ladies' man and enjoy life than to become a knight who worships a god he does not believe in. A moment later, the young man looked intently at his companion and, touching her face, asked if she knew how to win a woman's heart. He smiled and said that the most important thing is not to show your sincerity. She was taken aback and froze for a moment, but after a few seconds, she apologized and said that it was somehow rude. He smiled and said that there were attacks. She looked away from him in embarrassment and said as she left that if he was going to talk nonsense, then they should go back. She was shocked and did not understand how she could have been so stupid to think that he was talking to her seriously. Tristan looked intently after the young lady as he realized that winning her heart was now impossible. The next day, Kale looked closely at the young lady and asked if she had enjoyed her walk at dawn. She smiled and stood still for a moment, looking at her fiancé. The young lady in turn choked in surprise. Kale looked at her in surprise and asked if everything was okay with her. She was shocked, wondering how much he had found out, because she knew that she had definitely returned from the night market unnoticed. She looked at her in bewilderment, asking what he was talking about, because she hadn't even left her room yesterday. He smiled and said that, of course it was. And she must have been busy all night, running here and there. He smiled and asked if she hadn't come to him in a dream at dawn. She looked away from him in embarrassment as she realized that he was only talking about a dream. She was taken aback and asked in bewilderment what she was doing in his dream. He smiled and asked if she really wanted to hear that. He said with a smile that he thought the sun was still too bright for such conversations. She was shocked, didn't understand what he was even talking about. She screamed that she didn't perceive him like that. He smiled and said that he was just joking. Enrica looked at the young man with confusion and wondered if he was a man or a fox, but still she couldn't take her gaze off him. She saw how he interacted with the birds, with tenderness and affection, sitting at ease. She looked at him with a smile, because she saw that in front of her was the one she had known before. She was very puzzled because she knew that that alien image seemed to her just a dream. He looked at her intently and asked if something was bothering her. A moment later, the young lady asked her companion if he knew how to hunt. He was taken aback and looked at her in surprise. Looking at the young lady, he asked in bewilderment why she was suddenly asking about such a thing. Enrica said that every year at this time, the royal family held a hunting party, and she always wanted to go to one of them. Looking at the young man, she said that she would like him to participate too, if of course he didn't mind. He sighed heavily and said that if this was what she wanted, then she didn't need to ask permission. But a moment later, he said that this time, the Duke was participating in the hunting party. She was taken aback by the shock, and at that very moment she was bitten by a bird. She was scared and looked at the young man. He sighed heavily and said that he probably would not be able to attend for some reasons. Kale, looking at the young lady, he said that if she had any problems, he would not be able to be by her side. She was surprised since the Archduke had to participate in the hunt and her fiancé had to be absent. She wondered if this was her sister's evil plans. She did not understand why everything was so complicated. The young lady looked closely at her companion and asked if there was some way. He sighed heavily and said that he was worried about many things. But if her intentions had not changed, then he thought that they should find someone to protect her. Some time later, they came to the knightly order, which was located in the Count's estate. The young lady looked around carefully as she had seen knights walking around the mansion several times, but did not know that they had a separate place. A moment later, the man shouted that they had arrived. At the same time, the young lady shuddered and screamed. Kale looked closely at his companion and asked if she was okay. She sighed heavily and said that she was okay. She was just a little scared. Kale looked at his subordinate with bewilderment and asked how he managed to move so silently since his fiancée was scared. Barkos was taken aback and looked at his master with bewilderment. Since last time he himself ordered us to train stealthily. A moment later, Kyle looked at his knight with cold fury. Without uttering a word, the man hastily asked his master for forgiveness. He walked closer to the young lady and apologized for frightening her, and also introduced himself and said that he was the deputy commander of the Order of Dawn. She looked at the young man with a puzzled expression and said that it was a pleasure to meet him. He looked at the young lady with a smile and said that he had never thought that he would meet the bride and their commander, and therefore it was a great honor for him. Enrica looked at her companion in bewilderment and asked if he was the commander. He smiled and said that he was, and that he had some skill with a sword. Barkos looked closely at his master and said that, as he had ordered, he had already gathered all the knights, so in a few minutes they went over to the order. The Count looked at everyone present and said that some of them might already know, but he would formally introduce his young bride. The young people began to whisper among themselves as the rumors turned out to be true, because that same ruthless commander had gotten married. The young lady was shocked and did not understand why the atmosphere was so strange. She understood that she was supposed to become the Duke's bride earlier, and she was aware of the fact that her fiancé would be perceived as the lover who had stolen her. He looked at everyone present and said that they should now get to the point. Looking at everyone present, he asked if there were any volunteers to guard his bride. She was puzzled, as she understood that knights who valued honor would hardly want to guard someone like her. But a moment later, she looked at the young people in surprise. She was very surprised, as everyone without exception raised their hands. Enrica was in shock. She didn't understand what was happening at all, because she expected a completely different reaction. The Count looked hard at his knights and said that they could answer honestly, and he promised that there would be no consequences. At the same time, the man quietly muttered something under his breath. But a moment later, they all shouted that they wanted to work with people too. The young lady froze for a moment in surprise. They knew it was better to guard the sweet lady than to undergo hellish training from their demonic commander. They looked closely at the young lady, hoping that she would choose someone sooner. The Count looked closely at his companion and asked with a smile if she liked someone. He took a fork and said that she was the main person in it, and her opinion was the most important. She smiled and thanked him for the warm welcome, but everything was too sudden. The Count looked closely at his bride and said that if she liked someone, then this could also become a problem. She looked at him in surprise, still not understanding why he said something like that. He looked at her with a predatory grin and said that it was all because he was a very jealous person. She froze for a moment, as she was surprised by his words. At the same time, the knights were taken aback, and with pale faces looked at us with surprise at his cold-blooded commander. The young lady in turn shouted especially to the groom to calm down, as everyone was looking at them. But the knights clearly understood that this was a warning from the commander, as he warned everyone who intended to think about something dark. At the same time, the young man ran in a hurry to his master as they received an urgent message from the royal palace. He returned and asked his bride if she could wait a little. Enrica said with a smile that everything was fine, and he did not need to worry about her, but he still had to return quickly. The Count looked hard at the young lady and said that, however, he could not leave her alone. A moment later, he told Hayden that he was to take care of the young lady while he was away. Hayden, with a joyful smile, shouted to the commander that he would take care of everything, and he should just trust him. A moment later, the young knight, with a joyful smile, told the young lady that it was a great honor for him to serve her, and until the commander returned, he would do his best to serve her in the best possible way. He said that he had only become a full-fledged knight a month ago, but in his passion and aspirations, he was second to no one. She smiled and asked him to take care of her. They walked around the hall for a while, where he showed her everything and told her about everything. She was surprised since the hall was truly huge. He smiled and said that most of the combat training was carried out here, and if they were lucky, sometimes the commander himself could join their training. She smiled and asked if the commander was a good warrior. He smiled and said that, of course he was, and the commander was one of the best warriors on the continent, and he himself had never seen the commander lose. The young lady thought for a moment, as she knew it was very strange. She realized that his name must have been mentioned at least once in the novel, but unfortunately, she did not remember anything like that. Lost in her thoughts, she unfortunately did not notice how a fragment of the sword was flying towards her. After some time, the young lady was taken aback, because she felt something. But after a few seconds, the young knight blocked her with his body. He took the full impact, and with his crash, he fell to the ground, but managed to save the young lady. Enrica rushed to the young man in a hurry. Sometime later, a young lady sat next to the knight and asked for his forgiveness. He smiled and said that he was fine, and was informed that he only had a small crack. She looked at him with sadness, as she knew that, for a knight, a hand is life. She then tried to deflect the blow with her magic, but her power was too weak to do so. She was very upset, because she knew that if her magic had been a little stronger, she would have saved herself and the knight. The young man looked closely at the young lady and said that she should not worry about such things. He said with a smile that if she was the bride of their commander, she would soon become their mistress. Hayden looking at the young lady, the lady said that it was completely natural for a knight to protect his master. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if he would like to become her bodyguard. The young man froze in surprise for a moment, but after a few seconds, he asked in embarrassment if she was really serious now. In a hurry, he left his bed and asked her not to take back her words. He shouted that she should wait for him for a few seconds. He ran around the room, confused, and looked for his sword. A moment later, he handed his sword to the young lady and said that in order for Togo to become her bodyguard, he needed to go through the appointment procedure. He said with a smile that she should hold the hilt of the sword and hit him on the shoulder. She froze in shock and wondered if it was all happening too fast, but she agreed anyway. A moment later, he said with a satisfied smile that from now on, his life belonged to her. She looked at the young man with a smile and asked him to take care of her. But a moment later, a knight entered the room and asked the young man if he was all right. But he froze for a moment in surprise when he saw that the young lady was standing with a sword in her hand, and his comrade was kneeling on the ground. He was shocked because he didn't expect anything like this. With lightning speed, he rushed to his comrade and asked if he had received the assignment without the presence of the commander. Hayden smiled and said that everything was exactly like that, and this assignment was in a simplified form. The young man was in shock. He shouted to his comrade that the appointment could not be approached so frivolously. At the same time, the young lady looked at the young man in bewilderment and asked who he was. He was taken aback because he realized that he had completely forgotten to introduce himself. With the speed of lightning, Sasha approached the young lady and offered her his apologies, and he also informed her that he was a knight from the Order of Dawn. Sasha sighed heavily and said sadly that because his sword broke, he almost put the young lady in danger. She sighed heavily as she realized that it was he who was involved in this incident. Sasha was puzzled. He said that he felt terrible, but he intended to inform the master of his mistake and ask for appropriate punishment. She looked at him closely and asked if there was any need for that. She looked at him with a smile and said that when even such a durable training sword broke, it probably showed that he had gone through a lot of training, and she personally found that worthy of respect. She looked at the young man with a smile and said that for this reason, they could just focus on training and leave the situation between them as a secret. Hayden, looking at the young lady, he said to his comrade that she was like an angel. Sasha looked closely at the young lady and said that he completely agreed with his comrade. Sometime later, the young lady met with her fiancé. Kale looked closely at his companion and asked if she had appointed Hayden as her bodyguard. She smiled and said that it was so, but a moment later, the Count fell silent unexpectedly. For her, Enrica looked at him in bewilderment and asked if he was really angry. She sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, she had decided without his consent. He smiled and said that he was not angry because the knight was very young, but he was experienced and loyal, and he was the first candidate he chose to guard her. However, he believed that this meant that she was truly interested in him. The young lady was shocked and wondered if things were really that bad. Enrica looked intently at her companion and said that she had something important she wanted to ask. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was sure she wanted to learn fencing. She smiled and said that unfortunately, She couldn't rely on just him and her bodyguard until she regained her magic, and so she thought it would be better if she at least learned some simple self-defense. He looked at her with a smile and said that he understood everything, and if this was her decision, then he would help her in any way he could. He smiled and asked if she would like to try swinging the sword slightly. She looked at him with a smile and said that she would do everything now. But a moment later, she was taken aback and began to shake as she did not understand how she could lift such a heavy sword. At the same time, the young man looked at her with a smile. Coming closer to the young lady, he said that they should start from the very basics. He tenderly leaned closer to her and showed her how to comfortably hold the sword in her hands. At the same time, the young lady was filled with embarrassment. She was shocked because he was standing too close to her. Kale looked closely at his companion as he saw that she was embarrassed, but at the same time, he was also a little embarrassed. A moment later, he smiled and said that he thought he heard a heartbeat from somewhere. He smiled and asked if it was just his imagination. She was shocked and screamed that if he teased her like this, she would stop her classes. He came closer to her and, hugging her, said that this was not possible because she started it herself. She was in shock but did not answer. Some time later, knights approached them and watched them closely. They whispered to each other as they had never seen the commander behave like this before, and laugh while looking at someone. Some time later, the young lady returned to her room after a long and grueling training session. She was shocked because she didn't know that it would be so difficult for her to do something like this. Enrica was puzzled because she knew that she would have to go through torment. She understood that if she had made a contract with a demon and fully restored her magic, she would not have to train so hard. A few seconds later, she entered the room as she knew that she would definitely make a contract with him today. In a hurry, she called the demon. But for a moment, she was taken aback and looked around in surprise because she did not understand why it was so quiet in my room. After a few seconds, she lit a candle and decided to carefully examine the room in search of her cat. A moment later, the young lady was consoled by the sound of a voice she had heard before. She looked up in surprise as she realized that he was right there. She was in shock, did not understand what was going on and why he did not turn on the light, and sat in the dark. She went up to the top floor and froze in shock because she saw a young man instead of her cat, whom she expected to see upstairs. In turn, she flew over and froze in place from shock as she did not expect to see something like this. A moment later, she screamed that he was a pervert and ran away from the young man in a hurry, but he screamed and reached out to her. She screamed and asked someone for help, but at that very moment, he caught his footing and accidentally fell on her. She froze for a moment. He looked at her intently and told her to calm down because it was him. Enrica slowly touched his ears and asked in bewilderment if he was really Vermont. Some time later, they sat looking at each other. She sighed heavily and asked if this was his real form. He sighed heavily and said that it was, and also asked how many times he needed to repeat it. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked why he was always in the form of a cat. She asked if he really wanted to seem cute to everyone. Vermont was shocked and didn't understand what she was even talking about. He sighed heavily and said that it was easier to control his magical power that way. Vermont said that now he didn't even have enough mana left to support the basic transformation spell, so he returned to his true form. Vermont sighed heavily. She looked at him in bewilderment and called out. She ran closer to him and asked what was wrong with him, as she wanted to know whether he was in pain or not. She looked at him in bewilderment, but at the same time, he could clearly smell the pure magical energy that was emanating from her, so he couldn't stand it any longer. He sighed heavily, restraining himself with the last of his strength. A moment later, he said that they could sign a contract. Enrica was surprised by this statement. She said that she was not at all against it, but he had not wanted to do something like that until recently. She knew that she had to make her contract with him before he changed his mind. Enrica looked closely at her comrade and asked what she needed to do for Togo to make a contract with him. He sighed heavily and said that he had to absorb her magical power because she was giving off a terribly appetizing smell. Enrica froze for a moment in surprise. But at that very moment, the young demon pulled her towards him. She was in shock because she couldn't move, and after a few seconds, she realized that he had bitten her. She was confused and wondered if this was how he was absorbing her magic. A few seconds later, she rose into the air and looked at him in surprise. After everything that happened, he looked at her intently and said that they were now connected by blood. Vermont looked at her with a fierce grin and a satisfied smile and congratulated her, since she was now a real magician, and he called her his mistress. Some time later, the young lady stared at Vermont, as she simply could not believe that he was in front of her in his true form. It shocked her because he was very handsome. Looking away from the young lady, he asked what had happened. He wanted to know if she had already fallen in love with him. The young lady was taken aback and shouted that this was not the case at all. She sighed heavily, as she knew that he was as annoying as he had always been. Vermont looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was really going to take part in the hunting party. She was taken aback and looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand how he knew about this. He smiled and said that he had merely overheard the conversation of the knights in the mansion. But in turn, he did not understand why she would go into such a dangerous place, especially with her frail stamina. She sighed heavily and said that for this reason she had made a contract with him. Vermont looked closely at the young lady and informed her that even after the contract, she would not be able to cast spells easily right away, especially in her case, where her magical power was high and her skills were not very good. He looked at her intently and said that she should not take unnecessary risks, and therefore should try not to get lost in the forest. Vermont said that he would first teach her a simple fire spell, so that she could warm herself up if she got cold, and he also wanted to show her recognition magic, so that she could distinguish edible plants from inedible ones. Enrica was shocked and asked him to stop grumbling so much. He looked at her intently and said that the most important thing was that if she wanted to call him, she should just make a small cut on her neck and then shed blood. He looked at her intently and said that he would appear anytime and anywhere. Enrica sighed heavily and asked why she should do something like that, since she didn't like pain. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't want his mistress to suffer either. He looked at her intently and said that she should still not forget that perhaps one day, one drop of her blood would save her life. Some time later, she said goodbye to her maid, as she had to go hunting. Sarah looked at her mistress intently and apologized for insisting on her own way, but she knew that she would most likely need her help. Enrica smiled and said that everything was fine. She did not need to worry. A few days ago, Sarah learned that she was going to a hunting party, so she asked the mistress to leave her at the estate. Sarah said that she had some business that absolutely needed to be done. Enrica looked closely at her maid, since she had no idea what exactly was being discussed, but she could not refuse, since she knew that the girl probably had her own reasons, which she did not know. Enrica smiled and said that she would have loyal knights with her who would protect her, so Sarah did not need to worry. Sarah glared at them with fury and asked them to take care of the young lady politely. She said that if even one scratch appeared on her beautiful face, she would be very sad. Hayden looked at the maid with a happy smile and said that she did not need to worry, as they would of course take care of the young lady. Sasha looked intently at the lady and asked what she was thinking about so intensely, as she had a very gloomy look. Hayden smiled and told her knight that she was okay. She remembered how he told her wife that the Archduke would be present at this reception, but he would most likely not be able to come for certain reasons. She sighed heavily and looked into the distance with sadness, since she knew that her fiancé would not be at the tournament. He was also worried about the possibility that she would see the Archduke, but in turn, she was clearly aware of the fact that she had to find out what her sister was really up to. She understood that even if she ran into the Duke, he wouldn't be able to do anything to her at a hunting party full of nobility. She knew that everything would be fine. She didn't need to worry about such things. Sometime later, they arrived at the place, and the young lady looked around in admiration, as she saw that the atmosphere was even better than she expected. She looked at her knight with a joyful smile, and said that she would walk a little, as she wanted to look around the area. He smiled and agreed with her, and also said that he would change into armor and immediately catch up with her. She was unsuccessful, passing by men who started a casual conversation. But a moment later, she entered the depths of the forest and froze for a moment as she saw beautiful animals. She spent time with them with a joyful smile, and they followed her. But a moment later, the young lady was taken aback, as she had not noticed how far she had gone. She hoped that she had not missed her knight, and realized that she needed to return as quickly as possible. But after a few seconds, she turned around because she heard loud stomping. She froze for a moment in shock when she saw a man dressed entirely in black armor. Attending events organized by the royal family was his duty as an archduke, but for him it was not something pleasant, because behind the name of a royal event, there were always hidden noble political games, which tired him to the point of exhaustion. But the words of the young lady, which usually irritated him this time, for some reason did not affect him. He remembered how she suddenly said that she would also like to take part in a similar event. Kale didn't understand why he didn't want to disappoint her. A considerable amount of time had passed since he had received the first report of her movements from the man who had been introduced to her. They said she often slipped away at dawn and did something else. He assumed that she learned about the hunting technique in a similar way. But it was very strange that even knowing that she was hiding something from him, he did not want to forbid her these dangerous antics. The very fact that her efforts were aimed at removing his curse somehow seemed pleasant to him. He knew that she was thinking about him and doing everything for him. Some time later, the young man informed his master that His Majesty the King had summoned him to the audience hall. Kale sighed heavily and, pouring out the tea, said that he would go right away. As he left, he told his subordinate that as soon as the audience was over, he should bring his armor and prepare his horse, as he needed to go somewhere. The young man was in shock. He hastily and nervously asked what if during the reception the king wanted to see him. Kale said that his deputy could stay next to the king and come up with something, and they also had to report that he went deep into the forest for hunting, or come up with something similar. The young man looked at his master intently and said that if something went wrong, His Majesty might be angry with him. He was in shock, not understanding where his master was heading. Kyle turned around and informed his subordinate that he was heading to his bride, as he had, unfortunately, a bad feeling. Some time later, the young man finally met his bride. The young lady was taken aback and in fear asked the young man who he was. But a moment later, she froze in surprise as she saw her fiancé. He looked at her with a smile and asked if she was really scared. She was very surprised and did not understand how he ended up in such a place. Because he had previously said that he had other things to do, the Count smiled and said that he finished them a little earlier since he was still worried about her. She looked at him in surprise, knowing that her bodyguard had been waiting for this hunt for a very long time. Kale said that the young man was most likely resting now. Enrica looked at him in surprise and asked if he had really snuck in to see her instead of the knight. He sighed heavily and said that every word she was saying now was about her faithful bodyguard. The Count looked intently at his bride and asked when they had managed to become so close. He sighed heavily and with sadness in his eyes asked if she wasn't happy to see him. Kale, with the speed of lightning, climbed onto his horse and said that if that was the case, he was leaving, and on the way he would call her faithful knight, since that was what she wanted. The young lady was in shock. She screamed that he should wait. With the speed of lightning, she grabbed him by the collar of his clothes and asked him not to leave. He froze for a moment. Enrica said sheepishly that she had no idea what was going on here, but she was very glad he had come. She smiled and asked him not to leave. He looked at her in surprise as he did not expect this. A moment later, he sighed heavily and laughed. Enrica looked at him in bewilderment. He smiled tenderly as he looked at the young lady and said that he simply could not cope with her. She was confused by such a statement and did not understand why he suddenly said such a thing. A moment later, she was taken aback and said that there was something on his cloak. He smiled and said that he found a rabbit in the forest. Looking at his bride, he said that he thought that she might like the rabbit. Enrica shouted with delight that the rabbit was very cute. She smiled and said that they could release him somewhere safe. Kale smiled and said that he thought about using him so that she could practice hunting. But a moment later, he sighed heavily and said that it would be better if she pretended she hadn't heard such a thing. A moment later, the young lady finally let go of her small, sweet gift. Enrica looked after Sweet Rabbit with a smile and informed the young man that it was time for them to go back. But a moment later, she looked at the rabbit in bewilderment as he stopped. She froze in place in surprise as she saw his red eyes directed at her. The rabbit told her that she should be careful about her surroundings. After he told her these words, he ran into the forest, and she, frozen in shock, stared after him. Enrica was taken aback when she asked the young man if he had heard the rabbit speak. He looked at her with a grin, as if he didn't understand what she was talking about. She was shocked and asked if he hadn't heard, because the rabbit had told her something in a human voice. He sighed heavily and said that it was possible, because this forest was called the Forest of Spirits. Since ancient times, he belonged to the royal family and was almost untouched by people, so wild, mystical creatures remained in the forest and spoke. Some magicians are able to understand their speech. He said that maybe they just encountered one of them. Looking at the young lady, he asked what the rabbit had told her. She was taken aback and said that he had told her that she should be careful of her surroundings. But a moment later, they turned around because they clearly heard a scream. Enrica Napogano looked at the young man and asked what had just happened. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately he didn't know, but they needed to check where the scream was coming from. He glanced sideways at the young lady and said that she needed to return to camp as she would be safer there. Enrica looked intently at her companion and said that she would refuse this offer since she wanted to go with him. She understood that this incident could be connected with her sister. A moment later, they arrived at the place where the scream was coming from. Kale was taken aback and looked into the distance. He was in shock as his knights ran away in a hurry and were shouted at to run away. But unfortunately, there was no time for an explanation. The man shouted that everyone should remain calm. Kale looked at the knight intently and asked what had happened. In a hurry, the man shouted that monsters had appeared. The man told the count that they saw a magical creature. Kale looked closely at the man and asked if there was any precise information. He also asked if there were any casualties among the people. The man shouted in a hurry that fortunately, the creature did not approach the people directly, but among the people who had just escaped, there were several witnesses who had seen the creature. Kale looked closely at the man and said that it seemed like the creature had not gone that far. So he asked the knight to bring him eyewitnesses. The young lady looked anxiously at her companion and asked if they should report the problem to the royal family and stop the reception. He sighed heavily and said that this is what they would do in a normal situation. But he was puzzled, as he knew that the current king was a rather conservative man. He said that the hunting party is one of the largest events organized by the royal family. Obviously, he would want to hide such a serious problem from the nobility. She was shocked because she did not know what to do in such a situation. He sighed heavily and said that for now, the best way out was to deal with the magical creature very quietly. But first, he intended to take her to camp and then do the rest. But a moment later, the young man felt someone's presence. He quickly hugged his companion and told her that she should bend over while he pulled her to the side, and an arrow flew above them. Enrica was very scared because she unexpectedly saw an arrow. Meanwhile, the mercenaries stood behind a tree, waiting for the fight. They shouted that it was definitely him, and they had to kill him. The young man looked intently at his companion and asked for forgiveness for this. With lightning speed, he closed her eyes, and at the same time dealt with the mercenaries with fury. The remaining men shouted that they must not let him go. A moment later, they hurriedly went deeper into the forest. Enrica was in shock and did not understand who attacked them. But moreover, she was alarmed since they wanted to kill them. He sighed heavily and said that it was most likely an assassin who was sent after him. The count looked intently at his companion and said that he could not yet say for sure whether this was true, but he was sure that the first prince had sent them. She was surprised she didn't understand why the first prince told them to hunt him. He sighed heavily and said that he supported the second prince, not the first, so he apologized to his companion for dragging her into a very unpleasant situation. She was shocked, wondering if this was the same main character who was head over heels in love with the heroine Sophia. She was surprised because she did not expect that her fiancé supported the prince. As they raced through the forest, the mercenary took aim at them with his bow. A few seconds later, he released an arrow, but fortunately, the duke pulled the horse towards him, and they were able to remain unharmed. But at that very moment, unfortunately, he lost control of his faithful horse, and they fell into the abyss. At the same time, he hugged the young lady tightly, who screamed without realizing it. She was in shock because she knew they weren't stopping, and so she wondered how long this would continue. But a moment later, it began to live, and she sighed because she realized they had finally stopped. She froze in shock when she saw where they stopped. He sighed heavily, and she alarmed screamed and called him. Looking around, she said that he should let her go immediately, as there was no need for him to put himself in danger. He was taken aback, for a moment, did not answer her, but after a few seconds, he asked with a grin, what if he refused? Enrica was in shock. She screamed that he should not joke about such a situation with her, since she knew that if he was alone, he would be able to get out. Looking at the young man, she shouted that she would somehow survive with the help of magic. He looked at her intently, but did not answer. But a moment later, he let go of his hand, and they flew down together. He smiled, hugging her, and told her that she didn't need to worry, but she froze in shock, not knowing what to do. Kale said tenderly that he would definitely protect her. His words reassured her, and so she closed her eyes with hope. After some time, the young lady lay quietly in her bed. She slowly opened her eyes and looked around her in bewilderment. Enrica was a little confused, because she didn't understand where she was. She knew that she had just recently fallen into the water with her fiancé, but a moment later, she clearly heard someone's voices. Looking into the room, she saw herself and froze in place, but she was in shock because she realized that she was not alone there. But next to her, there was some person. Enrica sighed heavily and told the Duke that he might not be the man they said he was. He sighed heavily and asked what rumors she was talking about and what exactly she had heard. She said that she had heard that he had killed all his brothers and ascended to the throne in a struggle for succession. He looked at her sharply and said that unfortunately it was true, and asked if she had heard anything else. She said that she had heard that he enjoyed shedding blood, and that he was cruel and violent, and that the reason he married her was to have a toy to torture. He looked at her closely and said that he could not deny that there was cruelty in him, but a moment later, he promised her with complete confidence that she was the only one who would never have to deal with this side of him. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why he would say such things. He leaned closer to her and said with a grin that she was for him. The young lady froze for a moment, as she unfortunately did not hear the rest of the sentence, and at the same time the Count shouted to her in a hurry and called because he was very scared. She looked at him in surprise and bewilderment. After a few seconds, she sat up and looked around, wondering if she had been dreaming. The young lady was taken aback as the young man with the speed of lightning hugged her tightly. Kale sighed heavily and said that he was very glad that she was safe, as he was very afraid that something could have happened to her. She smiled and thanked him for saving her, but a moment later, she said that it hurt a little as he was squeezing her very hard. The Count was taken aback and asked for forgiveness, and at the same time, he let her go with the speed of lightning. She asked in surprise where they were now. He sighed heavily and said that they had been carried far away by a strong current, and this was no longer the territory of a hunting party. She was in shock as she realized that they were lost. Therefore, trembling with fear, she asked what if they had to live in the forest all their lives. He said with a smile that this was not the worst prospect. Kale said that unfortunately he and his knights knew this forest well, and it would not be difficult to return back. He looked at her intently, but the young lady was taken aback and, trembling with fear, said that there was danger behind her. Kale sighed heavily as he was puzzled because he didn't even have time to finish speaking. A moment later, they clearly saw her magical being in front of them. Kale looked at the creature with a smirk and said that he didn't know whether he should thank it for saving him from having to look for it. Milady turned around with lightning speed as she clearly heard some noise behind her. At that very moment, she looked with fear at another creature and shouted to her companion, but unfortunately, she didn't have time to say anything more as she was grabbed. She was in shock as she had nothing to breathe. She was shocked as she understood that unfortunately, she was almost incapable of anything, but she still wondered if there was a way to deal with the enemy. Some time ago, Enrica thanked her teacher with a smile for teaching her magic before leaving at anyone's reception, but she didn't know if she needed to read so many books. He sighed heavily and said that she needed to read all of them to lay the foundations of magic. She was surprised to read that monsters did not walk in places where there was no shadow. Vermont looked at her closely and said that it was true, because most monsters had a weakness to light in common. He smiled and said that by using light magic, one could hold back the monsters. And with a little power, he looked at her intently and said that even with her pathetic abilities, she would succeed. She was shocked as he had insulted her. She sighed heavily as she knew she had to try the light magic he had told her about earlier. And after a few seconds, Enrica used her magic on her opponent. At the same time, the young count was dealing with the rest of the monsters. A few seconds after she had won, she fell to the ground with a crash. At that very moment, the young man caught her with lightning speed and asked with a smile if she was okay. Enrica sighed heavily as she was exhausted from this battle, and she also felt dizzy. He looked at her closely and asked if she was hurt anywhere. Enrica smiled and said that she was okay, and also thanked him. He smiled and said that she should rest for a bit while he would deal with the rest. Kale dealt blow after blow to his opponent with ease and grace. He sighed heavily after he had dealt with almost everyone, but a moment later, unexpectedly, for him, the monster attacked him. Kale managed to block the monster's attack and put his hand out. The young lady was shocked because she did not expect this. Kale threw his enemy back with lightning speed and dealt him several blows. Enrica ran up to him in a hurry as she was very worried. She was shocked because she noticed that he was injured. Kale looked at his companion with a gentle smile and said that nothing serious had happened. He smiled and said that the most important thing was that she was not injured anywhere. But a moment later, he froze in shock when he saw that she was crying. Bursting into tears, she said that it was her mistake to suggest going to the appointment. She screamed that she was only a burden to him and that he suffered for her. He was in shock because he did not expect this. Kyle came closer to the young lady with a gentle smile and said that he did not save her to see such an expression on her face. Wiping away his bride's tears, he smiled and said that she should not cry, at least for his sake. She sighed heavily and looked away from him in embarrassment, but still agreed, "We're after me." She said with a smile that he should give her his hand since she learned a spell that stops bleeding. It could help him. She looked at his hand in surprise and asked why the condition seemed even worse. Kale sighed heavily and said that he was the monster they had just fought, a species that fed on kurin fruits and secreted poison. He noted that most likely the poison had already begun to spread throughout the body. She was shocked, as she did not expect such a thing, but he calmed her down and said that the poison of the fruits is not dangerous to the body, and rather this substance causes hallucinations, and it was usually used as a truth serum. Enrica sighed heavily and said that if it was not harmful to the body, it was very good, even though it was truth serum. She smiled and said that he had no secrets from her, so everything would be fine. But the young man in turn was very angry and thought differently. Some time later, they were sitting together in that cave. She was in shock. She didn't know what to do, because he said that this poison was not harmful to the body, but she saw that his condition was getting worse and worse. A moment later, the young lady offered her companion the herbs she had found and the fruits. She said they had a fever-reducing effect, and she had prepared a small medicine especially for him. He smiled and thanked her. She asked him not to persist and to get some sleep. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't want to do it, because if he fell asleep, then under the influence of the poison, he would definitely start talking nonsense. She smiled and said that even if he scolded her or treated her badly, she would understand everything. She knew that this poison was something like a hallucinogen, and this was not his true face. She smiled and said that he had to cope with the poison, and for this, he needed a good rest, so he should lie down immediately. Kale looked at her intently and said that even if he went a little crazy, she should not leave him, because it could be dangerous in the forest at night. She smiled and said that she would not go anywhere. Some time later, the young lady stared at the young man who had fallen asleep. Enrica sighed heavily as he fell asleep, and she felt calmer. As soon as the tension subsided, she too began to feel sleepy again, so she decided to get some sleep. But still, at the end, she looked closely at her companion as she was very worried about him. Looking at him tenderly, she said that he should get well soon. Some time later, she opened her eyes as she thought she saw something. Enrica was taken aback and wondered how long she had slept. But opening her eyes wider, she froze in place in shock as she saw her fiancé pointing his sword at her. Trembling with fear and bewilderment, she called him. Kale in turn looked coldly and intently at the young lady not answering. She froze in shock and didn't understand why everything turned out this way. He looked at her intently and asked who she was. Enrica was shocked and said that such jokes are simply not funny. He took it off, looked at her less, and asked if this situation really seemed like a joke to her. Kale looked closely at the young lady and said that he would ask her one last time who she was. She was in shock, wondering if this was really the side effect he had spoken about earlier. She knew it simply couldn't be that he had lost his memory. She looked intently at the young man and at that very moment introduced herself and also said that she was his fiancée. Earlier he had wounded Ruka while saving her. She asked if he really didn't remember anything. He looked at her coldly and said that she was lying to him because he did not believe that she was his bride. And besides, he did not save her. He said that he would never do something like that. She trembled with fear because she understood that this was complete madness. Kale looked closely at the young lady and said that such an innocent face could actually be a skilled killer. He did not understand why she kidnapped him and dragged him to a dark place. She was shocked and screamed that this was not so. She asked if he remembered what day it was and how old you were. He looked at her skillfully and asked if she really took him for a fool. Kale said that he was 18 years old. Enrica froze for a moment in shock. She realized that this was not just memory loss, but that he had returned to the past. She was shocked because he had lost 4 whole years of memories. Enrica looked intently at the young man and told him to listen to her carefully, because now he is not 18, but 22. They were in the forest where the hunt took place. He saved her, but he was poisoned by the monsters that ate the raft Quran. Because of this, he has problems with his memory. He looked at her with cold fury and asked if she really wanted him to believe this. He asked how she would prove that she was his fiancée. She thought for a moment and wondered if she should tell him about his curse. She knew that if she didn't tell him about it, he would take her for a spy, and if something went wrong, he would chop off her head. Looking at the young man, she timidly asked if she needed to prove her love. She said that he gave her jewelry and clothes every day, and even before the wedding, he gave her a room in his mansions. She asked if he would really care so much about a person he didn't love at all. He coldly said that he didn't remember it, and it turned out that she didn't have any objective evidence that she was his fiancée. She was shocked and screamed that their memories were the evidence. Kyle looked at her intently and shouted that since the novel was quite interesting, he would let her go without unnecessary torment. She screamed when he swung his sword at her, but a moment later she realized that nothing had happened. Enrica froze in shock as she saw her fiancé writhing in pain. She rushed to him and asked if he was okay. She was puzzled because she didn't know what to do, because she understood that I hadn't completely recovered yet. She said that he suddenly grabbed the sword and overexerted himself, so she asked him to lean on her. A moment later, she circled around him, checking his temperature, checking his temperament, and checking the wound. Enrica clearly saw before her the one who had just pressed a sword to her throat. Now he looked at her with an anxious expression on his face. He sighed heavily and asked if she was really his fiancée. Enrica confidently said that it was so. He looked at her intently and asked if in that case she loved him too. Enrica froze for a moment, not knowing what to answer. He smirked as he approached her and asked us if she only loved him so much that a kiss right now wouldn't be a problem. She froze for a moment in embarrassment, as she had not expected this at all. She was shocked because she understood that if she refused, he would definitely begin to suspect her. Kale looked at her with a fierce grin and pulled himself up to her lips. A moment later, their lips touched, but he pulled back, and she froze in embarrassment and anticipation. After a few seconds, he laughed at the expression on her face. Kale looked at her closely and said sheepishly that it seemed true that he had a fiancée. Moments later, he said that he really didn't have the strength to quarrel with her and that he would rather sleep. She was shocked and asked if he would just fall asleep. Kale looked at her with a smirk and asked if she was really sorry. She embarrassedly shouted that, of course it was not so. But looking at the young man, she realized that he had not changed at all. She saw that since he was joking, she assumed that he felt better. But now, looking at the young man, she clearly understood that the temperature still persisted. She was in shock and didn't understand what to do if his memory never returned. Enrica, in turn, threw all thoughts away because she knew that now was not the time to think about it when he was sick. She understood that she needed to help him so that he could recover. Kale opened his eyes and slowly looked at the young lady. He sighed heavily and said with sadness in his voice that she was the first person who took care of him while he was sick. She sighed heavily and looked at him sadly and a moment later asked what his past was like when he was 18 years old, Kale. Looking at the young lady, the lady said that he mainly fought with his brothers and with the vassals who tried to kill him. He smiled and said that since he was still alive, it meant he had managed to gain power in the family. She smiled happily and said that he now lived in a magnificent house, and he had accumulated much wealth and fame. He sighed heavily and said that he was not interested in that at all, and he only wanted to know one thing. He looked at her closely and asked if he had become strong enough to protect her. Enrica looked at him in surprise, but a moment later said with a smile that, of course it was so, and he was her savior. He was very surprised to hear something like that from her, but in turn, he said with embarrassment that it was very good and that was enough. He reached out to her with a smile and said that if she was truly his bride, and if she loved him, then she was his only person. He smiled and asked her to stay by his side until he died. After that, they talked for a long time about how they lived, and about little things like their favorite weather and eating habits. She saw that he was sharp but a little naive, and also didn't know how to hide his emotions, which made him very cute. She looked at the young man with a joyful smile and told him everything, but a moment later, she noticed that he had fallen asleep. Enrica looked closely at the young man and said with a smile that she would be by his side until he died. She also said that they would definitely remove his curse, and he would live much longer than she did. The next day, the young lady woke up in a cave. She looked at her fiancé's clothes in surprise, but did not notice him. She was in shock and looked around as she was worried about where he had disappeared to. She wondered if he was wandering through the forest in a state of intoxication from the poison. She was very worried because she was worried that something might have happened to her. But a moment later, the young man entered the cave and told her that he had returned. She looked at him in surprise, and at that very moment, she rushed to him as she really missed being treated with respect. Overjoyed, she rushed to him and began to hug him as he had returned. Enrica smiled and said that she was very happy because she was very scared that he would suddenly not be able to come to his senses. He froze for a moment as he had not expected this, but after a few seconds, he hugged her tightly and apologized for making her worry. She sighed heavily as he was very tall. She sighed heavily and asked if he didn't remember what happened yesterday. He sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, he didn't remember anything, so he asked if she could tell him what happened. Enrica wondered for a moment what she should have told him. She remembered how he had tenderly said that if she was truly his bride, if she loved him, then she was the only one for him, and therefore should stay by his side. Enrica looked tenderly at the young man and said that he had not said anything at all, and on the contrary, it seemed that she had begun to love him even more. The Count froze in shock and embarrassment, as he had not expected anything like this at all. He smiled and said that he could now, when he spoke to her, eat a couple of currant fruits. She smiled and said that she simply could not believe that he had returned. A moment later, he sighed heavily and called her. At the same moment, he gave her something. Looking at his companion, he said that he had prepared for her a fang of that monster that they had slain yesterday. Enrica looked at him in surprise and asked if he had really gone after him since the morning. She was surprised and did not understand why she needed such a trophy. The Count smiled and said that if he handed over this fang to the royal court, they would certainly try to hide the existence of the monster, and they will say that this is the tooth of a tiger or a boar. And if she does this, then she will be chosen as the winner. She will receive a huge reward, and a grand feast will be arranged for the winner. And this is a very wonderful opportunity. After all, with it, she will be able to strengthen her position in secular society. She looked at her fiancé with a smile, because she knew that, in any case, it was a rotten royal court, and she wanted to use it. These are the moments she understood his character very well. She smiled and said that in that case she would accept it. But a moment later, the young man said that he had one more thing. He handed her a magic stone that he found along the way. Kale smiled and said that he did not know the details, but they said that this mineral was very helpful in restoring magic and its use. She was surprised and thanked him for such a trophy. He smiled and asked if she would like to try it. Enrica looked at her fiancé in surprise, as she was a little puzzled, but a moment later, they still came out of the cave as they wanted to try the stone. Enrica thought for a moment and remembered when she fought the monster and defeated it with her spell. She knew that in this case she could reproduce this very bright magic, remembering it. A moment later, she succeeded, and a seal rose above them. Enrica was surprised and shocked, at the same time as her magic was very powerful. The Count smiled and asked the young lady if she liked the effect. She smiled and said that the effect was visible, but she knew that it would take her a long time to learn to control the magic. She looked closely at the magic stone and wondered if such a thing could produce such a powerful effect just by being in contact with it. She knew she would have to find out more about this from her cat. At the same time, the young lady was rushing towards adventure. She glanced sideways at us at his knight when she stopped and asked if he was sure that she had really come to this place. He sighed heavily and said that it was so since the witnesses had told him everything in detail. Martha was a little puzzled and didn't understand why her sister went so far. A moment later, she was taken aback and screamed as she saw the remains of the creature. She was in shock and did not understand what had happened here and who was capable of defeating this monster. The young man said that he did not know what exactly had happened, but he knew that it had been done by a very skilled swordsman, and he also felt faint traces of magical power. Martha was taken aback, and looking at her knight in surprise, asked if her sister had already caught this monster. The knight said that these were not beasts at all, but monsters, and if they found out that such a thing had appeared on the territory of the kingdom, a great panic would begin. Martha was furious and shouted at him not to forget, and he answered her question at length. Martha looked closely at the young lady and said that he could tell her with certainty that magic was involved in this incident. Martha was taken aback and wondered in surprise if her sister had actually destroyed the creature. A few days ago in the duchy, Duke furiously raged because he knew that his daughter was ungrateful because he arranged for her to marry his duke, and now she stopped communicating with him. The Duke was furious because his reign did not even answer his letters. Looking at his daughter, he shouted that he wanted Enrica to use her position to gain support from the ducal house. But unfortunately, everything went to waste. Martha looked at her father closely and said that, even so, he still treated her cruelly. She sighed heavily and said that, if she had been hurt in the same way, she would have left the house immediately. The Duke froze in shock, as he did not expect to hear anything like this from his daughter. He looked at her and asked what she had just said. He was loyal because he did not know that it would be on his sister's side. He shouted that he believed that she was not like her sister. The young lady froze for a moment in shock, as she did not expect such a thing from her father. He came closer to her and said angrily that she should not forget how he spent his money on her education and comforts. He said that she was his daughter, and he loved her immensely. Squeezing her in his grip, he asked if she believed him. He looked at her intently and said with fury that she should go and find out why her sister was not responding. He wanted to know what she was up to. He didn't care at all what she was doing, but Martha had to stop her sister, because when she realized her place, she would surely answer them. The young lady was furious. She didn't know how her plans could be ruined. She didn't want to do anything too cruel to her sister. Martha understood that it would be enough to humiliate her slightly. The knight said that he would like to report for reference, because judging by the tracks, it looks like the one who caused the trouble lost all his strength, his horse, and left on foot. He understood that whoever was behind this, his return would take a long time. The young lady looked intently at her knight and called out to him. Martha looked coldly at the knight and ordered him to take the bone fragment of the monster. Before the young lady opened her eyes and woke up, the young man stared at her without looking. He looked at her with tenderness and trepidation, but after a few seconds, he lay down next to her. The Duke did not want this moment to end at all. Enrica looked closely at the Count and asked how far they were to the camp. He smiled and said that they would reach the camp in about an hour. He sighed heavily and asked if she was already tired. Enrica sighed as she was a little tired after a long walk. She was taken aback as she saw a hawk circling above her. The Count looked at the lady and told her that a messenger was approaching them with his letter. He told the young lady that the messenger could track them with their magic, and therefore she should lend a hand. A moment later, the young lady extended her hand, and the hawk landed on her hand. She was surprised and did not understand who had managed to send a letter to such a remote place. She was curious who the letter was from. Enrica saw that Tristan was writing to her as he had been looking for her, and did not understand where she was, as he was very worried. She sighed heavily as he spoke to her informally. Tristan wrote to her that as soon as he arrived at the camp, he started looking for her, but unfortunately, he did not find any traces of her, and now he was very worried that something had happened to her. He also said that her younger sister's actions having returned to the camp were now suspicious, as she had brought the bones of a monster and claimed that she had killed 2 huge monsters herself. The monsters were found on royal territory, and the aristocrats had reacted very violently to such statements. Tristan wrote that he felt she had something to do with it, so if she received the letter, she should return to camp as soon as possible. The Count looked intently at the young lady and asked from whom she had received the letter. Looking at her fiancé, she said that she had received a letter from a friend. This friend was Tristan. At that very moment, the Count's face changed. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile when they had become so close that she called him by his name, Enrica. She was taken aback because she realized that she had made a mistake. She looked at the young man closely and said that it was not the most important thing now, and he should look at what her friend had written, since it seemed that her sister was taking credit for the monsters they had killed. Enrica was puzzled, as she understood that her sister was obviously specifically pursuing her. She was in shock. She did not understand how her sister could make such an obvious move. A moment later, the Count read the note. He sighed heavily and said that he did not know what her purpose was in doing this, but if this continued victory would be hers. He looked at the young lady intently and said that she need not worry, because if he would go with her and give evidence, everything would be fine. But a moment later, they were taken aback because they heard some kind of noise. The young lady looked at the knight in surprise, as she did not expect to see him so quickly. Barkos was shouting and calling for the commander in a hurry. Barkos! He was very glad to meet the commander, as he had been looking for them for a very long time. He smiled and said to the young lady that it was very good that she was safe and sound. She shouted with a smile that she was very glad to meet him, but a moment later, the man was taken aback and shouted that they had no time at all. Looking at the commander, he said that the assistant had informed him that he seemed to be close to his limit. He shouted to the commander that they must return as soon as possible. The Count sighed heavily and told his subordinate that he did not need to make such a fuss, because he knew his body very well, and he could still hold out for another day. Enrica looked at the knight in surprise and asked what they were talking about. The knight hesitated, not knowing what to answer. The Count looked closely at his subordinate and said with a smile that he did not have to hide anything from her, since she was already aware of his curse. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he understood everything, and also informed her that the commander urgently needed to return to the tent. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked what the problem was.